Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN WhatIf 2.0, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Survived Alone? With villains. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Sea spray stung his senses as he crawled onto a mat of debris. Izuku clung to it for life as he bobbed in rough waves. The beating water threatened to push him off at any moment. Izuku winced as his already battered body was moved into rocks. The brief pain fell into hope. Rocks meant ground. Black whips sprung from his skin, lines thrashing before they felt the rock. Instantly he clung to them, pulling himself up. He dragged himself up the stone, thanking any god he could think of that the rocks were smooth. He fought against the water, crumbling as something crashed atop him. What felt like a metal screech left his ears ringing as he weakly rose from the water. He started to fall back with ringing in his ears, the sound making his head spin, but suddenly something tangled into the threads of Black Whip. The thing yanked him, forcing him to fumble up the rocks as he was ripped from the water. Before he could get his footing, he was tucked under someone's coat. He coughed past the water in his throat, someone patting him on the back as he did. He held on to them, looking up to thank his apparent savior. Stain, the hero killer, was looking back at him. Black Whip instantly coated his skin as he leapt back. He tightened the black strands over his battered body, determined to not let the villain at his blood. The villain made no attempt, just looked at him with what seemed to be worry. Stain opened his mouth to speak when someone shrieked. They both jerked their heads to the sound. Izuku shifted his stance to the screamer, surprised to see another villain, this one cowered against the rocks. Their strangely familiar face contorted with fear. As Izuku looked around, he found others' faces with similar looks. Some stumbled back as he turned to them. He began to panic, knowing whatever scared villains had to be dangerous, but then he saw his teacher, Aizawa, limp in a villain's claws. He locked eyes with the villain. He recognized them as the animal-like Chimera, a man who fought by Nine's side. The man's ears twitched as Izuku stared him down. Izuku noticed other, less welcomed, familiar faces. Overhaul was barely awake, tossed over the shoulder of Chimera. Wolfram and one of his crew stood close, both braced for a fight. A blue shimmer caught his eye. He realized it was Flecked Turn as the man crawled up the rocky bank. Right behind him was Gentle Criminal, holding tight to another limp body. He was outnumbered and outmatched. Even if they were battered and bruised, he was too. None of them were in shape to fight. Looking back to Chimera, he stepped forward, now praying Black Whip was keeping the villains from recognizing him. He held out his arms, gesturing to Aizawa. The villain's nose twitched as he looked down at the limp hero in his talons. A moment and the villain caught his drift. The titan of a man stepped toward him, giving him his unconscious teacher. Overhaul groaned as Chimera shifted him into his arms, but now the villain didn't have the hero. Izuku held his teacher close, instantly heading away from the beating waves. The man was frighteningly cold. Izuku could feel him shivering. The villains followed, heads hung as rain pelted them. They didn't seem to be in the mood to fight. Soon they found themselves beneath wreckage. Izuku recognized it as the prison ship they all had been on. Its hull battered and dented. Most of the damage was probably from the storm shoving it onto the shore. Wind whipped at the empty hull, making it groan and whine. Lines that once held lifeboats cracked like WHPs, loose in the wind. Izuku swallowed hard. The missing lifeboats showed most had gotten off safely. Those boats were sturdy and stocked full of supplies. In all honesty, it was a far better situation in those boats than on land right now. The ship cracked and roared. Izuku jerked at the sound, finding eyes on Wolfram. As his lackeys supported him, the villain wrapped the ship into a safer shape. The hull tore open, digging into the earth to hold steady. It wasn't going anywhere soon. Now it overhung the rocky beach. While it was wet still, it was safe from rain. Wolfram nearly passed out in his colleague's arms but managed to limp to the new cover with the rest of the group. Izuku was quick to set a spot for his teacher. He did his best to soften it, collecting the driest scraps of driftwood and sea trash he could. To soften it further, Izuku made a bed of whatever grass and weeds he could find. His teacher's face looked less pained as he laid him out on the makeshift surface. Suddenly a shape approached, gentle. The man's hair was soaking wet as he held out a wounded villain. Izuku spotted Chimera carrying Overhaul behind him. He even saw a limping Wolfram being led his way. He realized they wanted him to make more beds. Without a word, too tired to speak, they only held out their companions with pleading eyes. He hesitated for a second but began to build another bed. If the villains saw him as a nurse, that was better than seeing him as a threat. As he began to care for the wounded, he could finally take better note of who was there. The walking, gentle criminal / Tabita Danjuru, Stain hero killer / Akaguro Kaizome, Flecked Turn, Chimera / Kanchijuru. The wounded, Overhaul / Kai Chisaki, Eraserhead / Aizawa Shoyuta, Mummy / Makihara Hoyo, Wolfram. Then there were two sick villains. He had to keep them from the others as they were a health risk. One was Nobu, a lackey under Wolfram. The other was so far gone he couldn't recognize them. The unknown villain died under his watch. They had been all but gutted in the capsizing ship. The villain hadn't stood a chance. He enlisted Wolfram and Stain to help bury him. A metal coffin, so that upon rescue he might be identified. As he returned to Nobu's side, the villain trembled. Izuku couldn't blame him. He was bleeding from wounds all over. Worst of all, the villain had ingested lots of seawater. He was vomiting it constantly. He silently comforted the villain. He began to gently pet the man's green hair. It earned Izuku a glare at first, but the man soon gave in with a weak whimper. Izuku was still afraid his voice might blow his cover. So, he didn't offer words of encouragement despite knowing the man could use them. After a moment, Nobu let Izuku check him over. More likely it was a sign of weakness rather than trust. A rash in the mouth, dry lips and eyes. Clear effects of ingesting seawater. They all had done it. It was impossible not to with the waves. You would surface for a breath, and the sea would jump down your throat with a wave. All of them would be suffering the effects. Even so, they needed something to drink. The salt drained them faster than their exhaustion. Dehydration would be fatal if not treated. Izuku looked up at the rain. It came down hard and fast. But it was better than the ocean. Izuku gave Nobu one last pat on the back before the return to the walking group. The villains had never taken their eyes off him, not once. They didn't know who he was, but that was better than the other option. If they knew he was a hero, they might see him as competition and kill him. But with them not knowing who he was, he might be able to gain their trust. For now the villains were still wary of him, but Flecked and Gentle allowed him to guide them. He took them to the edge of the shelter. With some trial and error, he got Flecked and Gentle's quirks working to guide water into a boot. It was disgusting, but it was water. They would have to boil it for it to be safe for drinking. Wolfram was out now, weakly sleeping. Izuku couldn't risk waking him from healing rest. He came to Overhaul's side. The man grimaced at the offered water, but eventually his thirst got the best of him. He agreed to try and dry the shrubbery with his quirk. Without arms, the man had to dig his teeth into the greens to activate his quirk. It was a messy and convoluted process. Someone had to practically hand-feed the man the stuff. In the end, even this weak version of his quirk was enough. The dried grasses burned, making the damp woody shrubs snap and pop as they dried in the heat. Soon he added them to the fire, and it grew warm enough for boiling. Izuku was about to boil the water inside the disgusting boot, but Mummy crawled forward. He wasn't able to warp metal like Wolfram could, but he managed to make a bowl from the red binding his quirk was. By controlling a shard of metal, he shaped it into a bowl. One Izuku had to help him hold up. But he managed to hold water. And so, they had water. He wouldn't call the overturned ship shelter, however, it would keep the rain away. Now came the problem of food. How were they going to eat? What would they eat? As Overhaul tugged a branch off a bush with his teeth, he growled out that exact question. Should we just toss some grass in the water and call it a day? The villain asked as he spat the branch into the fire. The ensuing sparks made Mummy flinch. The water sloshed, but Izuku kept it inside. He gave Overhaul a glare for that. The man just sat, his breath wheezing as he did. It was an idea. I have yet to hear you offer one. Flecked came to the fire, pouring more water into the bowl. You don't like your bed? Nor your bandage? How about the water? We can't boil it if you keep adding cold water. Overhaul hissed. Izuku felt a headache twinge behind his eyes. This was going to be a nightmare. Let them rest, they have already done much for us. Flecht hissed right back. You aren't harassing the red one about the shelter, or lack of dead man at our feet. His name is Wolfram. Nobu piped in from his seat far away. Flecht nodded in acknowledgement before continuing. Why don't you feed us, H? Overhaul silently raised the stubs of his arms. Can't, dumbass. Izuku groaned. Suddenly he saw someone in their sickbay sit up. Wolfram growled as he glared at the arguing pair. Shut up, will you? Yeah. Shut you dash. Nobu snapped his mouth shut as his boss shot him a glare. Izuku noticed a lack of giant animal man and shot up his head. He missed how people flinched at the movement. He looked around, worried as he didn't spot him inside their drying camp. He looked to Gentle, shaping Black Whip to make himself resemble the man. Gentle only looked at him baffled. I think he wants the dog, Nobu told the man. Gentle sighed. He went into the rain a while ago, I can't see him through it. Izuku flicked Black Whip back into place, nodding in response to Gentle. Then he waved the man over, pointing him to the growing bowl of water. The man obeyed, dumping his collected water. He asked what Izuku wanted, and Izuku guided him and his quirk to hold up Mummy's bowl. Once the water was safe, he began to walk out. Only he stopped at the edge of the rain. He looked back at his teacher. The man was asleep but clearly wincing in pain as he breathed. He couldn't leave the hero alone with them. What if he awoke and he felt the need to defend himself? The numbers were stacked against him. And several villains were healthier than him too. Stain sat between the hero and the villains, his gaze firm. He seemed to be guarding the hero against the others. But would he actually do anything if Aizawa was the aggressor? He let out a long sigh, looking back out to the rain. Footsteps came to his side. He looked over and saw Flecht. I can look for him, it's not like I can get hurt out there. The suggestion that Izuku could hang in the air. Flecht watched him for an answer, and Izuku nodded. I would stop the man from fighting Overhaul too. Izuku turned back to the shelter as Flecht walked out into the rain. He shook off the little wetness he'd gotten as he started his way to Aizawa. Stain kept a close eye on him, but soon set his gaze back on the other villains. The hero killer had seen his face, Izuku was sure of it. Yet he'd said nothing, much less expose Izuku to the others. Perhaps it was their history at play. The killer did call Izuku a good hero after their fight after all. So, he wasn't on Stain's kill list at least. But the others? They might blame him. After all, if he'd never defeated them they would never have been in jail. Or in the transport ship. Izuku came to Aizawa's side, pressing his fingers to the man's throat. He felt for a pulse. He could feel one, but it was weak. More than that, the man's shaking hadn't stopped. His clothes were wet and stuck to his skin, much like the rest of them. Izuku sighed as he let go of the man. He needed to be drier and warm. Izuku started by freshening up his bedding. It was soaked from the man's runoff. As he prepared another bed, he actually returned to the fire. He plucked some of the warm stones, taking them back to lie down. He made the new bed atop them. They were warm enough to offer comfort, but not enough to make fire. Izuku laid his teacher over his new bed, and eventually his shivering started to lessen. Izuku took advantage of the man's hero suit, stuffing his pockets full of more warm stones. His boots too, honestly anywhere a stone could fit Izuku put one. Soon Aizawa wasn't shivering anymore and he seemed more relaxed. Izuku then gave the others the same treatment. Wolfram was a little more grumpy about it, but he let it happen. As Izuku was stuffing warm stones into every spot he could, he came across something of note in Wolfram's pockets. A multi-tool. How had the villain gotten a hold of this? He certainly didn't have it when he was in his cell, right? Izuku realized he didn't know how the ship had failed. Maybe the villain had broken out with the tool and then sabotaged the boat. No, Wolfram was too smart for that. At most he might have messed with the crew to trap them somewhere and taken over the boat. But that hadn't been what happened. All Izuku knew is the stabilizer in the boat failed, and then the ship was torn apart by the storm. Who's to say it wasn't the ship just showing its age? It could have failed on its own without sabotage. Izuku took the item anyways. The villain growled at him for it but seemed to recognize he wasn't in the health to use it anyway. It would be far more useful in healthy hands. Izuku returned to the men boiling water. He was happy at the sight of steam and bubbles. Now, how was he to serve it to everyone? Using the boot was out of the question. Especially after Nobu, its owner, put it back on. He considered bugging Wolfram, but the metal of the boat wasn't probably drinking safe anyway. He glanced about, trying to come up with something. In the end, he started rooting through driftwood. If he found a piece or several big enough, Overhaul could shape them. Tossing the litter about, he wandered into the rain a bit. He kept the fire in sight at all times, backing away as he rooted about. Suddenly he bumped into something. It dropped water on him, making him jump up and spin around. Oh, it was just a young tree. He watched as the tree wobbled for a second. It eventually stopped, only swaying in the wind. Looking behind the young tree, he could just spot older trees past the rain. They were pale with dark black spotting here and there, their papery bark finally make it click for Izuku. They were birch trees. Not exactly common where he lived. But he knew them. A little. Izuku glanced at the trees. They were rather thin for a tree, but maybe they were just on the younger side. One should be more than enough for their needs. He dared to get into the woods a little, quickly setting sights on a tree. With a tight binding of black whip and a harsh tug with one for all, the tree snapped. It fell with a great thump, water scattering off it and its neighbors. He dragged it back to camp. Overhaul at this point was more than willing to do anything to get some water, so getting him to make cups from the tree was easy. The result was pretty much just a tall bowl, but it worked fine. Izuku heated them for a bit, getting the wood to harden up, making it all the better for drinking. After that, everyone got a cup of hot water. They had truly secured a source of water now. It felt like forever until Chimera and Fleck's turn came back. Fleck wasn't bothered a bit. Wolfram on the other hand looked worse for wear. He was battered and bruised, but he dragged behind him something furry and dead. He tossed it toward them without a word, dragging his feet as he settled into a grass bed. Overhaul more or less squealed as the thing spilled blood onto the rocks. Izuku was quick to tug it away from the man, and closer to the outside. Chimera hadn't gutted it. Something that needed to be done before they could even think about eating it. It fought back pretty hard, careful of its hooves. Fleck spoke up, coming to Izuku's side. The man picked up one of its legs, showing Izuku the sharpness of its nails. If Chimera didn't have such thick skin, I'm sure it would have torn him up worse. Izuku hummed, not liking that. Animals without predators didn't have the instinct to run or fight back. If this thing did, that meant there was its natural predator. They would have to make sure it never saw them as a food source. It took hours to process the animal. It had been vaguely tapir-like with long legs and a shorter trunk. Izuku's skin was crawling with the ease Fleck had skinned it with. Said skin was now stretched out and pinned wide open with heavy stones. The sun had finally come, with it, heat. That and the water already had them feeling better. And the smell of pork was even better. It wasn't pork, but it smelled like it. The animal's meat wasn't as fatty as a pig's. But a pig has been selectively bred over generations, so you can't blame the tapir thing for not being the same. Izuku stuck the meat with a stick, flipping it over on the sheet of metal over a fire. It sizzled, the meat a crispy gold. It made Izuku's mouth water. The only thing that could make it better was some rice, breading, and maybe a little egg. He was getting lost. Is it done yet? Wolfram's voice growled from his bed. Izuku looked to Gentle, shaking his head. The man voiced his message. Not yet, good man. Gentle seemed to be Izuku's self-appointed translator at this point. Izuku would thank the man. If he wasn't afraid of his voice being recognized. It smells done. The man sat up in his bed, shooting them a glare. Are you trying to keep it for yourselves? He accused. Izuku rolled his eyes and Gentle scoffed. Excuse you, sir. Do you want to risk parasites and sickness? This is wild meat. It must be cooked much harsher than tame meat. Wolfram growled, to which a very tired Chimera growled right back. Chimera's was far more intimidating, and Wolfram relented. After a few more moments and some more begging, the meat was done. Izuku used the knife of Wolfram's multi-tool to cut the slab into even fractions. 8 to be exact. It is far easier than 9. Izuku would just wait and cook another piece. With a clean stone and a sharp stick, he made a round of the camp. Gentle took his piece with a courteous bow. Stain impatiently came to Izuku for his, but he did thank him for it. Flecht was half asleep when Izuku gave him a piece. He mumbled thanks. Chimera was asleep, but when Izuku touched it to his nose he snapped it up. Overhaul pouted but took it, complaining about a lack of seasoning. Mummy took it with shaky hands, eyes tired but thankful. Izuku had Wolfram wait for his sass. Nobu practically worshipped his piece before swallowing it. No, took more. Izuku took his time, cooking it evenly all over. At the end of the cutting, he went straight to Aizawa. He sat at the man's bedside, watching him breathe for a moment. He hadn't woken up yet. Needless to say, that worried Izuku. Luckily his teacher had no head wounds or chest wounds for that matter. But that made Izuku worry more. He didn't know what was wrong. He knew how to patch head and chest wounds. But he could find what was wrong. He'd even checked for signs of internal bleeding. Nothing. His teacher just seemed stuck in a deep sleep. Izuku took a pace for himself, then readied the rest for his teacher. He set it aside for a moment, deciding his teacher needed to wake up. He hadn't had anything to drink yet either. He needed both desperately. Maybe that's what had forced this rest. Izuku moved to his teacher's head, pulling the man's torso onto his lap. He took a piece of the meat, hooking a thumb in Aizawa's mouth to pry it open. But he stopped. What if he did it wrong and Aizawa choked on it? Would the man be better off left alone? Izuku stared down at his teacher's face. He hadn't woken even though his mouth was forced open. Was he already past saving? Maybe not if they were in a city. But here? Izuku couldn't just hand him over to a doctor here. Or could he? Izuku looked over to Flecht turn. He had skinned the animal so easily, he obviously had some medical history. Not only that, the robotic hands and the sight enhancements. Not to mention that network of mirrors he fought with that were plugged into his spine. He knew more than Izuku at least. Izuku sat his teacher up on some rubble before walking over to the half-asleep villain. Flecht noticed his approach instantly, lifting up his head. "You need me?" the villain asked. They all had gotten used to Izuku guiding them around for jobs. So when Izuku nodded, Flecht didn't hesitate to stand. He did hesitate, however, when Izuku brought him to Aizawa. "The hero?" Flecht asked as Izuku picked up the food. Izuku motioned with the food at Aizawa, giving Flecht a pointed look. The villain gave him an odd look, one that held suspicion. If we get him up and going he might fight. "He's not a dumbass." Stain spoke up from his spot. He was leaning against the ship hull, eyes closed as he tried to sleep. "If he does anything he'll haul but into the woods to hide. And hunt us from there," Flecht added. Stain shook his head. "He's outnumbered, he knows better." Flecht stayed silent and looked back to Midoriya and his teacher. "Only because you haven't led us astray yet." Izuku backed up as Flecht took his teacher in his hands. He held the hero by the back of his neck like an animal, grabbing a piece of food from Izuku. With the stick the villain guided the food down Aizawa's throat, forcing his mouth closed before taking his thumb to the outside of the hero's throat and pushing it down. Izuku watched curious and worried. About halfway Aizawa jerked but didn't wake. Izuku was afraid he was choking, but to his surprise, his teacher swallowed. "Only one more piece. This kind of rough treatment of the throat should be avoided," Flecht spoke, taking another piece from Izuku. This piece went down similarly. Next, Izuku brought Flecht a cup of water. To which Flecht promptly tried to hand the stick over to Overhaul, who gagged. Flecht glared at him, a demanding glare on his face as he tried to get the other villains to take it. "That's not going in a mouth." Flecht sighed, tossing it aside for a new one. "A tube, please," he said, a little nicer than the demanding attitude before. Overhaul glared back for a moment. He glanced at the leftover food, deciding on a deal on his own. "Another piece and you get a tube." Izuku didn't hesitate. His teacher needed this water. He moved over to Overhaul, offering him a piece. The villain took one, ate it, then promptly ripped the stick out of Flecht's hand with his teeth. A moment later Flecht was given a long, stiff tube. Izuku now watched as Flecht used some grease from the meat to make the tube easier on Aizawa's throat. He guided it into his teacher's mouth and further down. Next, he cupped a hand at its top and waved Izuku over. Izuku poured the water into Flecht's cupped hand, it dripping a little but most was guided into that tube. Soon the cup was empty and Aizawa had food and water in his stomach. Izuku did notice Flecht get him to swallow one more time, probably to clear his throat of the meat grease. Gross, but a good idea. Izuku laid his head on Aizawa's chest. There was a strong drumming of a heart. His teacher was getting better. He sat up from his position, looking down at the man. He wasn't deathly pale anymore, and he seemed more restful than comatose. Izuku was still afraid for the man's health and safety, but he couldn't ignore the improvement. With any luck, his teacher might awake soon. Izuku let out a long sigh before leaving Aizawa's side. He had more people to look after. Nobu, and most of them honestly, were doing much better after a meal and drink. Some were still shivering, but a rotation of warm stones kept that at bay. As Izuku helped Nobu warm up, he couldn't help but glance around. The rain had passed, an aggressive sun settling overhead. Izuku spotted Mummy and Kai sunning themselves just out of the ship's shadow. The heat would warm everyone up, but it posed its own threat, heatstroke. They needed something more than shade. Wolfram was okay but tired from all the metalworking he'd done the night before. Besides, metal shacks would prove harmful. The rust could scratch or even infect, and the sun would make it hot to the touch. More natural cover had to be made. Izuku turned to his two main workers. Flecht and Gentle, the pair of men were hard at work harvesting anything they could off the animal Chimera killed. Gentle less so, but he was doing his best to offer Flecht a lending hand. Izuku turned away from them, they were doing important work. No need to have them do something else at the moment. Not when the animal was a risk. If there were predators on the island they no doubt would be attracted to the carcass. Breaking it down was of utmost importance. That left Chimera himself or Stain. He doubted either of them knew how to build structures. It might be best that Izuku make a shelter for them all on his own. He slipped away from arresting Nobu and over to Stain. The villain noticed his approach immediately, sitting up to Izuku as he got closer. "What now?" The villain growled at him. Izuku silently motioned to the fire and then to the sleeping forms. He did his best to gesture what he wanted, for Stain to take over healer duties. He was the only one Izuku trusted to not kill the vulnerable Aizawa. The villain groaned with the realization. "Why now? What on earth do you have more important to do, huh?" Stain snarled at him, taking a literal stand. The man towered over him. "Listen, you do all the womanly work and us men will dash." Izuku kicked the man between the legs without thinking. The insult had stung, as incorrect as it was, but it still hurt. But at the same time, did that warrant a D-kick? Izuku watched the villain stumble for a moment, face contorting in pain. "Fine." Stain snarled, far less intimidating this time. The man hobbled with his hands between his legs to their sickbay. Izuku noticed the many eyes his way. Only everyone immediately turned away from him once he noticed them looking. Izuku stood there for a moment, really letting Stain's words sink in. Stain thought he was a woman. During the fight they had Stain call him male, so Stain didn't recognize him after all. A weight lifted off his shoulders with that. As he walked away he heard the villains start to chatter. "Really? You do remember we were on a prison boat, right?" That was Wolfram's condescending voice. "What about it?" Stain huffed. There was a note of pain in his voice. Wolfram scoffed before continuing. "She's probably killed a man, given that's what got us all on the boat, being confirmed murderers." Wolfram thought he was a girl too? Izuku slipped into the tree line, stopping to look at himself. He ran his hands down his sides. He did have a vague hourglass shape. Though that was an effect of his workout routine. So, Izuku glanced back to the camp, seeing the chattering villains. If they think he was a girl, they would be less likely to recognize him as himself as he was male. Well, Izuku wasn't going to correct them then. He decided. Besides, he's been a bit girly, since childhood anyway. And being called a girl wasn't all that off-feeling. He just not liked the idea Stain offered. A woman could certainly do more than woman work, he mentally mocked Stain. The man was denser than Izuku could have ever imagined. Well, time to find a spot to build. He learned quickly the island was more or less all trees, at least for the distance Izuku was willing to explore. Despite the heavy rain, Izuku could only find ponds, lakes, and the odd stream connecting them all. He stared down at a pond, seeing the flooded grass underneath the water for about a foot. If this was the island flooded, he'd hate to see it in drought. He found the deepest lake he could, a good old throw a rock at it, for a test good enough for him. He searched about for a good spot, finding an area of exposed rock close by. If he had to guess what the rock was, he'd say shale. It was rather brittle on the surface but harder than anything he'd seen deeper. A good foundation, no doubt. He set to cleaning off an area, just barely noticing Mummy and Kai. The pair had followed him but weren't acting aggressively. They seemed merely confused about what he was up to, and smart enough to know asking would get no verbal answer. Still, Izuku decided to humor the men. He plucked a few scraps of shale from the ground and came to the men, stacking them in the shape of a cartoonish house. A home? But from what? Mummyeth. Surely this stone isn't good enough, right? The villain poked the shale, it crumbling at the tiny touch. Izuku shook his head, pointing out the surrounding trees. Like a log cabin then? Kai asked next. Izuku nodded. He turned back to his work, leaving them to their relaxation. They lay at the lakeside, resting their tired bodies halfway into the calm waters. The birch trees were hard, even harder to plunge into the solid stone. Izuku ended up tapping at the stone with one for all, cracking it, digging out the mess, and repeating. Soon he got holes in the solid ground, holes he then inserted uprooted trees into. Of course, he had to deroot them first. Then, Izuku took a mix of the rubble and mud from the lake bottom to back the holes around the logs, to secure them. He cut the logs only as tall as himself. By punching them, he was careful not to break a bone at least. I don't think that's how log cabins work. Kai added from the lakeside. Izuku waved him off in favor of continuing. Each tree in the ground had one right across from it, in between, a gap that Izuku now dragged trees into. It looked strange, but the outer logs kept the inner logs in place. That way he didn't have to dig any more than he had to. Besides, this was just the start. He ended up laying 2 logs deep, then he filled in the floor the best he could. He patted down mud and rubble for several hours, but his audience just grew. Gentle and Flecked had finished their task and found them at the lake. They then promptly sat down with Kai and Mummy to watch Izuku work. Like a bee making honeycomb dash, he heard someone comment only to get shushed. As weird as it was to be watched, it was keeping the villains out of trouble. So he'd let them watch him like he was some how it's made TV show. Besides, they might learn a thing or two. Satisfied there was now some insulation from the cold ground, Izuku returned to the walls. The walls he made pretty much the same way as the walls for the foundation, just with thinner and taller trees. It was way easier digging the small trees into the logs below than it had been to get those logs into the ground. Thanks to that, Izuku was able to do a lot more, making the walls just as sturdy despite being made out of thinner trees. He'd left the tops of these trees, so Izuku stripped them of leaves and climbed up the finished walls to weave all the branches together. This part easily took the longest for him, there were no shortcuts for it. Now and then he'd have to jump off, collect more branches, then climb back up to weave those in too. He was determined to leave no gaps. Eventually he felt satisfied. At least with that part. Now as the men watched, Izuku gathered any loose stone he could, mixing it together with more mud. But he also made thatch to add this time. To his surprise, Flecked eased closer to help. He happily showed the man how to make the thatch. Take a bush, beat the sheet out of the branches with something hard, and tada! Long stringing plant fibers. Izuku tore the thatch up before adding it to his mix. Though something was still missing. Izuku glared at the mess in front of him, prodding at it. It didn't feel like cement mud. He'd fallen in the stuff before, so he knew what it was supposed to feel like, and this wasn't it. Distantly he remembered mud huts were a thing. So maybe there wasn't a need for actual cement in this case. Izuku sighed. Well, he could always figure out cement later. Right now they needed shelter. Anything was better than nothing. So, Izuku got to covering absolutely every inch of the exterior in the mix. Evidently, the act of throwing a glob of the mess at a structure looked fun, and Mummy got in on it. Even Gentle gave in, mostly to help pat it down instead of just throwing it like Mummy. Soon enough he was waving them off. He gave a last look over before all that needed to happen now was for it to dry. He looked at the blinding sun above, well, now to the side. It was touching the trees, but its heat was already drying the mud. The fact the sky looked clear was also promising. By tomorrow they might have an actual home shelter. Izuku was scanning over his build the next day when he noticed a lack of blue in the villain herd. Flecht wasn't with the group. Now the idea the man was hurt was nearly impossible, thanks to his quirk, but Izuku couldn't rule it out. Izuku first questioned the group about the missing member. The lot of them were relaxing in the new home. Some even make bedding out of dry leaves. Gentle was the one to answer him. He was going to the old camp, last I checked. Gentle hummed. Izuku nodded and left to find the blue man. But when he came to the old camp, there was still no Flecht. Izuku felt worry bloom as he scanned the campsite. The fire was cold, and the supplies had long since been transferred to the new camp. Izuku looked around the ship's beached portion. He saw no footprints in the rocky gravel that was the beach. But could Flecht even leave footprints? He didn't touch anything after all. Izuku could see no entrance into the ship at ground level, so he must not be inside the ship. Somewhere on the island then? Izuku turned back to the forest, trying to catch any sign of the man. As he moved through the leaves he felt a pull at his senses. Izuku stopped in his tracks, turning to face that pull. He recognized the feeling as one for all. The past users must know something. He followed their guidance right away. As he did, he noticed some snapped branches. There were also trampled ground plants. Someone or something had walked here for sure. He followed the trail, finally catching sight of familiar blue. Flecht was on his knees with his back to Izuku doing something. Izuku crouched to the ground and snuck closer. If Flecht ran off to do this, there was a chance it was something he didn't want others to see. And no, he wasn't using the bathroom. Izuku had been sure to designate an area people were allowed to do that. Everywhere else was a no-no. Anyway, Flecht was certainly doing something he didn't want the others to see. Izuku crawled on his hands and feet, in a way Aizawa-sensei himself had taught the class. He crawled closer and to the right to see what the man was up to. Izuku blinked, sitting up a little in surprise. Flecht was no doubt trying to make something close to a shrine. The small structure was small but topped with altar. All made of driftwood and stones, but definitely a shrine. Izuku watched as Flecht placed an offering of animal meat on the tiny altar. The man then stopped, folding his hands in his lap and bowing. Izuku could just hear the man mumbling what had to be a prayer. Why was Flecht hiding this? Izuku watched baffled. It's not like the man was making human sacrifices or anything. But Izuku stared at the exposed meat on the tiny altar. That was dangerous. Animals might eat it and start seeing them as a food source. But Izuku wasn't about to rip this man away from his faith either. He'd just have to figure out how to make it safer for Flecht. Izuku slipped away without exposing himself. He started thinking about his options. He couldn't let Flecht just leave food out in the open, but faith in a higher power was more than life-saving to some. So, the only real option was to make it safer for Flecht, and the others possibly, to worship who or whatever they worship safely. Izuku tested the hinge he'd just made. It was small and attached to a small door. It was a little stiff but worked rather well for being made of wood. Izuku stuffed the hinge and door onto the gap in front of him. So, this a food shed? Chimera asked as he sniffed the door. Izuku shook his head as he pressed the finished wall and door onto a stone mud box. He'd fixed it across the lake from the home, far enough away to be a good walk. You could just see the camp on the other side. It should be far enough that even if an animal got into it, they shouldn't immediately realize the far larger shape across the lake might have a tasty snack in it too. Chimera gave him a puzzled look. What then? Other supplies? Izuku shook his head yet again. He walked away a bit, picking flowers he found about. He quickly returned to the structure, lining the inside of the shape with the plants. Then he pulled out a smooth stone and set it inside. Finally, after that, he placed a leaf-wrapped scrap of meat on that stone. With the door closed, he motioned for Chimera. The villain hesitantly complied, sniffing the Is this supposed to be aromatherapy? Then why did you put the meat in? You can't even smell it. Chimera scratched at his head, flinching as Izuku happily clapped his hands together. Izuku turned away and started to waddle off. Wait, was that the point? Chimera called as he sped back to Izuku's side. This time Izuku nodded, but Chimera didn't look any less confused. Izuku tended to a fire atop the stony area a safe distance from the home. It burned low, just as he wanted. He set a metal scrap on top, followed by more leaf-wrapped meat. He flicked off a few daring flies of tonight's meat dinner. He stared at the cooking food. The leaves could hold back flies, but not rot. They would need more food soon. In all honesty, it was a little risky even eating this meat too. Izuku looked away from the fire and into the darkening area. Across the lake, he could see the blue shimmer of Fleck's quirk. Ah, good, he found the new altar. Hopefully he wasn't creeped out. Izuku looked away from the man and to the surrounding forest. There had to be some edible plants out there. Plants that store longer for meat. Izuku let out a sigh, deciding he should try and look. He waved gentle over to the fire. The man happily took over the cooking duties for him. Izuku left the camp, sparing a glance inside the home at his teacher. The man was far more relaxed now. He looked more like he was napping than in pained sleep. Izuku couldn't help but compare the sight to when Aizawa would sleep in the middle of class. He hoped the man would wake soon. Straight face, straight face. Izuku eventually came across some berries. He went to pluck the food when something in his head made him stop. He shuddered at the mental image of himself vomiting up the berries. Izuku gagged at the thought and continued on his way. Not those then. Izuku came across acorns next, making him pause. He looked up, surprised to see a new type of tree. Instead of birch, he was now seeing oak trees. He returned his gaze to the forest floor. He stared at the tree nuts as a feeling of hunger washed over him. He liked his lips at the sight. These seemed edible. He quickly pocketed several handfuls. He continued on his way, suddenly feeling another pull of one for all. He stopped in place, looking for a threat or another trail. But the pull lead him to a plant? Izuku eyed the fluffy greens, not too sure. But he did trust the past users more than he trusted himself. He was about to collect the greens when something told him to pull, so he did. To his surprise, he saw some rather scrawny carrot-like roots. Perhaps it was wild carrots? Izuku saved those too. Several more and more, yes, and no's. And Izuku had a good armful of food. It would surely improve everyone's health for sure. A balanced diet is key, at least that is what Mom always told him. For safety's sake, Izuku washed everything first. As he started, he noticed some of the acorns floated, while others sank. Izuku poked the floating ones, flinching. A bug crawled out. It must have hollowed it out by eating it. He let all the floating acorns float away. He gathered the sinking ones with the rest of the food and went on his way. He started piling it all onto the scrap metal to cook, Gentle watching with surprise. The man let out a low whistle at the sight. "You sure we can eat all that?" Gentle asked. Izuku nodded, motioning to Wolfram and Chimera specifically. "Ah, good point. Those two probably weren't satisfied with a small portion of meat." Gentle hummed. "The variety will do us good too," Kai added in. The man was melting into Mummy's side. Because Mummy helped the man reach an itch on his neck. Not everything the human body needs can be sourced from one food source, so if we all eat a little of everything we should do well. Kai finished explaining. The food cooked with a rich smell. Even the little burning that did happen could be forgiven for the taste of everything else. As everyone ate their share, Izuku came to Aizawa's side with a leaf of mixed food. He knew it wouldn't be smart to force it all down the man's throat. Maybe he could mush it all up and give it to him like water? Izuku hummed, eyeing the man. The man's chest rose and sunk with even breaths. The man's face was relaxed and calm, but he would wince now and then when he swallowed. Yeah, best to make an impromptu protein shake. Izuku laid the leaf down and left. He started looking around the camp for some rocks to grind the food down with. Soon he found 2 suitable rocks. One to put the food on, the other to mash the food with. Izuku came back with a hum, nodding to the eating men by the fire as he passed them. He crawled into the open door frame. The rocks he held fell to the ground with a clatter. Flecht perked up from the campfire, turning to Izuku worried. The man moved to stand but Izuku held up a hand. Izuku watched shocked but delighted as Aizawa, huddled into a corner, ate from the leaf. The man's eyes were harsh and red, his quirk at full flare as he paused mid-chew. Izuku waved Flecht back, the man obeying the order. He sat beside the fire, but he didn't turn his back to Izuku or the home. Izuku didn't see a need to change that, the man was just worried about his food source being killed is all. Izuku turned back to his teacher slowly. The man was whipping food off his face with his sleeve. An abandoned leaf showed the man had eaten his full. He must have really stuffed his face for the few seconds Izuku had looked away. Luckily he seemed fine, the fact he had an appetite at all was even better. Thinking quickly, Izuku turned back to Flecht, pointing to some spare food. The villain nodded before bringing him the food, sitting beside the home's doorway. Izuku ignored Flecht's intense gaze as he stepped into the home. Holding the food with Black Whip, Izuku raised his hands to show he wasn't armed. He got to his knees in the doorframe next, then slowly reached the meal to his teacher. Aizawa looked at the meal, then Izuku again. The way his body was so perfectly still was scary but good. If Aizawa was able to be so steady, he must be feeling okay. Izuku could feel the other villains starting to notice what was happening. Luckily Flecht kept them back with glares and harsh whispers. Finally, Aizawa held out a hand, one Izuku slipped the food into. As Aizawa took the meal, Izuku pulled back Black Whip and sat down fully, letting his hands rest on his lap. He did his best to look relaxed and non-threatening as he could. His teacher's eyes never left him, those black locks constantly waving in the air. The burning red of his eyes made Izuku fight down a shiver. Even fresh from an actual coma, his teacher was terrifying. At least Izuku thinks it was a coma. They hadn't been taught that in class yet. Aizawa finished his meal quickly, eyes starting to twitch as they dried out. Izuku noticed immediately, moving his hand to point at his own hip. Aizawa watched with suspicion as Izuku tapped on his hip, then, his expression broke into realization. The man's quirk shut off with a surprised blink. Aizawa raised his arms off his body, looking at the supply belt built into his hero suit. He popped open the container Izuku had motioned to and pulled out eye drops. The man looked up at him again, eyes narrowing. Izuku glanced behind him and at the now silent villains. They were watching him like guard dogs waiting for an order to maul. He couldn't risk them knowing who he was, not now. Izuku sighed and turned back to his teacher. He'd just have to let the man figure it out on his own. He stood and turned away from the man, returning to the villain crowd. He did his best to soothe their tempers, offering reassuring shoulder pats. He motioned back to the fire and food, hoping they would relax again. They followed the guidance, but Izuku could see how tense they all were now. Not that he blamed them, in their minds, any hero was a threat. Even an injured one. He just prayed they wouldn't act on that fear. Mummy was the one to notice when Aizawa slipped out of the home. The mostly silent man motioned for Izuku immediately. Izuku gave him a thankful nod before watching his teacher. The hero of course noticed he was being watched. He locked eyes with Izuku for a moment before eyeing the surrounding villains. He could see his teacher notice he was outnumbered and lacking a health advantage. The man eyed the group with apprehension. Izuku slowly stood, many eyes locked onto him as he did. He stepped away from his seat before motioning for Kai and Nobu to make space. The pair scooted away from each other to leave an open spot. A spot Izuku motioned to while looking at Aizawa. The hero hesitated, but eventually gave in. He moved slowly and steadily as he took a spot by the fire. As he did, Izuku tapped Wolfram on the shoulder, glancing pointedly at the cups at the villain's side. The villain grumbled but started passing out the cups. Shortly everyone had an empty cup. Izuku hummed, pleased, as he set a metal bowl on the fire. With Mummy, he went to the water's edge, them both collecting water in their quirks. Pouring the water into the metal produced a hiss of steam that made Aizawa flinch. Still, the hero stayed in place. The silence of the camp slowly turned into the boiling of water. The bubbly sound started to be broken up by cups scooping up the drink. As everyone began to drink, someone finally dared to speak. Just an idea. Nobu started as he blew on his hot cup. We don't fight at all while we're stuck on this island? Izuku turned to Aizawa with most of the villain group. The hero was stiff, not from pain but from the tense air. Eventually, the man gave in with a tired sigh. Fighting will just prevent survival, not dying should take priority over the law, Aizawa admitted. Wolfram snarled and was about to stand, but he stopped when Izuku placed a hand on his shoulder. Izuku gave the villain a stern look, making the man melt back into his seat. Still, the man spoke what he had on his mind. Ain't no law here anyway, no prison for you to throw us in ether, Wolfram growled to the hero. Izuku saw the twitch in his teacher's brow. I'm not exactly a saint, you know. I'm not against working with fish to catch a shark dash. That made Wolfram surge from his seat. You calling me a fish, you dash? Izuku smacked the villain across the face before yanking him back to his seat. The thick air dissipated a little as Wolfram stood stunned for a long moment. The villain touched his face, looking at Izuku shocked. With a glare and motion, Izuku ordered the man to sit again, which he obeyed. The man held his bruising cheek as he glared at Aizawa. Izuku got a few rude glances too, but Wolfram seemed to get the idea. He all but pouted in silence after the correction. Izuku turned as he felt a prickle of one for all. He locked eyes with his teacher, the man's gaze hard and calculating. Izuku just sighed before returning to his own drink. He didn't want any of this drama, he just wanted them all to survive. Izuku was inside the home, weaving mats to sleep on when he heard some chatter. What surprised him was Aizawa's voice was among them. As he did his best to weave, he listened in on the conversation. What do you call him, dash? Aizawa was promptly cut off. Her, and honestly calling her is enough since she's the only woman here. Stain supplied after cutting the teacher off. Really? Not even a nickname? Aizawa questioned. It's hard to think of one, given she doesn't even talk, Stain elaborated. Not at all, silent as can be. That was Wolfram adding in. She gets her point across without words, so who cares, Chimera growled. Emdem comes to mind, but I'm unsure she'd care for it. Gentle spoke. That seems a little too serious. Nobu hummed. Maybe something like Shadow? She's kinda wispy and dark dash. What are you? 5. Wolfram huffed. Call her that and I'm sure she'll hit you. Hey, you don't know that. Nobu squawked. Gaia, Flecht said plainly. Izuku paused, noticing the silence of the other men as well. Gaia? Aizawa asked. I believe so, yes. Flecht answered just as plainly as before. He was acting like he was stating a fact. Wait, Gaia like the Earth God? Wolfram seemed to sign. Why the hell would you call a little lady like her, Gaia? The villain scoffed. Wouldn't an Earth God be massive or more like Chimera over there? What is that supposed to mean? Chimera growled. You know earthy? Wolfram elaborated. Or at least more animalistic? Over Chimera's growl, Flecht spoke more. Who are we humans to say? Are you suggesting she is Gaia? Stain huffed, he sounded amused at the idea. An aspect at a minimum, I suspect, Flecht answered honestly. Izuku stared to weave again as he listened in, a little confused. Where on earth had he gotten that idea? Why do you think that? Stain asked what Izuku was thinking. I had left to ask the goddess for help and dash, Flecht was cut off. You pray to Gaia? Nobu chuckled. Flecht seemed a little mad at those words if his tense tone showed anything. I do. I'll have you know the people of Athens have rich ties to the Greeks. Many of us still practice worship of the gods to this day. Oh, I guess that makes more sense. Nobu accepted. Stain, however, did not. Wait, hold on. You expect us to believe your god of choice just showed up to help us? Izuku could hear the man stand from wherever he'd been sitting. I'll have you know I tugged her from the water. She must have come from the ship. Not, Birdy, from the earth, to help you. Wolfram of all people tried to get Stain to calm down. Now come on, let the man have his faith dash. Stain snapped at him. She was in the water with us. Do you really want this nut job around? And you? Izuku heard Aizawa choke mid-sip. Why are you acting like you don't know sheet? You weren't on the boat. You tell us who she is. I was watching A block. She might have been in a different block dash. Aizawa tried to defend himself. Bullshit. You know something dash. The villain's voice kept rising, and Izuku left his project to stop a fight before it could begin. And you are in on it, aren't you? Stain really had lost it. He needed to separate the villain from the others. Izuku left the hut and locked onto the panicking villain. The others were trying to slip away from his wrath, but he kept catching them and claiming they were against him as well. The isolation from society seems to have claimed its first victim. Izuku cracked a WHP of Black Whip to gather the men's focus. Stain snapped his head to him, teeth bared in a snarl and eyes wide with something close to panic. His paranoia was getting the better of him. Izuku watched the man's eyes dart to the fire, and before he could stop the man he grabbed a burning log. Izuku rushed forward to keep the man from hurting anyone, including himself, but he didn't expect the burning log to get shoved into his face. He pulled back with a scream of pain. The voices of the past users screamed with him. He grabbed at his face, doubling over with the burning pain. He lashed out with Black Whip, snagging Stain before throwing him with all his might. Izuku tried to claw the burning wood out of his face. He heard a distant splash. Voices around him shouted for a moment only to cut off as he let out another pained wail. There was a fire in his eyes, the wood caught in the Black Whip hiding his face. He needed to put it out. He jumped high, letting float help him shoot into the air. With the force most of the splinters fell from his face, at least letting him spot the lake below. Izuku snapped with one for all to shoot into the water, ignoring the loud bang it left in the air. He hit the water hard, sinking deep. But it worked. Cold water rushed over his burning skin, cooling the heat. He scrubbed at his face again, the water helping to wash it all out. Suddenly one for all flared again, guiding him to form a bubble of Black Whip around his head. Next, the sixth user's quirk flared, filling up the bubble with mist. He gasped as he anchored himself to the lake bed. He coughed, surprised that he could breathe underwater. The mist must have forced the water out, leaving him blinking through the misty dark air. There was a small puddle by his chin, but he started forcing the sixth quirk more. Each time he was left with some moisture, but it was still better than fighting with Stain. He shuddered, feeling mist form around his body as well, insulating him from the cold water. It wasn't much better, but it was a bit warmer. He sniffled through the thick mist on his face. He needed a breather before surfacing again. He'd been working non-stop and for what? A stick of fire in the face? No, his teacher was awake now, that was something. He felt heat in his eyes as he tried not to cry. He didn't stop it. He broke into sobbing wails at the lake bottom, praying the water was keeping them from hearing how pitiful he sounded. The past users cried with him, letting their voices layer over his so that if they did hear, they might not recognize his voice as his. When Izuku finally surfaced again, it was night. The same night, or another he couldn't tell. He trod water for a while, staring up at the night sky. He sniffled a little as he looked around for camp. Eventually, his eyes found the home. Looking in the open door frame, he could see several bodies at rest. He blinked past the wet mist lingering on his eyes as he started to paddle over. Soon the rocky bank was under his feet, allowing him to walk out of the water. As he got grass under his foot, he shuddered Black Whip to shake the water off his body. The noise the move made caused someone to stir. Izuku watched a man sit up and broke into a wide yawn and stretch. As they finished their yawn, they turned to him. The man's face turned into one of surprise as he registered it was Izuku. Izuku stepped back a little as the man suddenly stumbled over the other sleeping men, getting a few growls from them. Eventually, Flecht managed to free himself from the home, hesitating as he stood before Izuku. Izuku looked the man up and down. Flecht seemed to take it as an invitation, stepping closer with his head lowered. "It is good to see you awake." Izuku gave him a quick nod. Flecht stepped closer again. "Are you feeling okay?" Izuku nodded slower this time, not sure what to make of this interaction. Flecht even moved closer. Stain didn't get you too bad, did he? He knelt on one knee, making Izuku jump a bit. Izuku stared as Flecht offered him a hand. He looked between the man and the offered limb. He saw no hostility. He carefully set a hand on Flecht's. The man smiled and set his other hand atop Izuku's. I'm glad you returned, Gaia. Izuku didn't know how, but he'd started a cult. Or would it be more accurate to say Flecht made a cult? He didn't know, and honestly, both were just as worrying. Luckily not everyone was in it, just Flecht, Nobu, and Stain. Still, 3 out of 9 people was scary. What was scarier was it seemed Aizawa was considering the idea. Hopefully he'd stay on the side of science. Izuku carefully washed acorns, aware of the eyes on him. He glanced to his side, where Nobu sat. The man was picking up acorns that floated away and placing them on the bank. Turning the other way he was Flecht, who was trying his best to copy what Izuku was doing. And Stain? Izuku stared ahead at the lake, seeing Stain waiting for any acorn that tried to sink out of Izuku's reach. When one would escape he'd quickly place it where Izuku could reach. As nice as the help was, it felt weird. Apparently, Aizawa of all people had brought up the Japanese belief of kami, offering that while Izuku may not be the Greek god Gaia, he might be a spirit of the island itself. Izuku had never taken his teacher for the type to believe in such spirits, but then again the man was secretive, and just woke from a coma. The 3 around him took the idea and ran with it apparently, though still calling him Gaia for lack of a name. Izuku let out a long sigh, scooping up the clean acorns. He pocketed the acorns in a pocket made with black whip at his hips before standing back up. As he did the men moved to follow, Nobu quickly gathering up the floated acorns. Instantly Izuku stopped him holding up a hand and shaking his head. Nobu hesitantly put the acorns back on the rocks, earning a sigh from Izuku. He motioned to the acorns and then the water with a pointed look. Eventually, Nobu caught on, pushing the nuts into the water to float away. Izuku nodded and turned back to camp. He ignored the hushed voices of Stain and Nobu's wonderings. Will we eat them whole again, Gaia? Flecht asked a more appropriate question. Izuku shook his head no, he'd seen and experienced just how hard that had been. Today he planned something different. Returning to camp he eyed the nearby rock faces. There clearly used to be a hill here, but some outside force broke it down. The idea it was a flood had been Izuku's first idea, but the storm they arrived with seemed flood-worthy yet this was clearly much older. Izuku worried just what had ripped the hillside open. For now, he was thankful for the access to clean stone. He swept the area clear of rubble before finding the biggest yet flattest stone he could. He laid the acorns out over it before walking off. The now confused men followed as Izuku gathered some birch leaves. He returned to the stone again, laying the leaf out and pushing the acorns onto the leaves. With a satisfied nod, he started work. The men flinched as he slammed a fist down on an acorn over and over and over until it was a grainy mush. Izuku quickly copied the process on the rest, resulting in a pile of grain mush. But he was not satisfied. He picked up a large stone, standing above the grain, and dropped the stone onto it. He repeated it until the grain was a bit finer in texture. Izuku was still not satisfied. He took a small flat stone, pressed it onto the pile, and ground it back and forth. Soon the grain was more like sand. Now Izuku was satisfied. He gathered the wet grain onto the leaves and walked to the fire pit. He shaped the grain into scrap metal. But it looked unedible. Some berries would fix that. Izuku stood and returned to the forest, his 3 tails following close behind. As Izuku walked to the berries he knew he could eat, Stain stopped him. Gaia? Stain called. Izuku turned to the man, only to spot Nobu about to stuff the non-edible berries in his mouth. Izuku let out a panicked squawk with the past users. He rushed forward and smacked away the berries, huffing at Nobu. The man looked at him shocked as he gestured wildly at the bush and shook his head. I don't think we can eat those ones. Flecht correctly guessed, earning a nod. Oh, sorry Gaia. Nobu sulked, avoiding Izuku's eyes. Izuku let out a sigh before setting a hand on the man's shoulder, giving him a soft look. Izuku knew he wasn't trying to poison himself, but he really should have asked if they were safe first. Izuku gave Nobu a soft shoulder pat before returning to his walk. This time he arrived at the bush with no interruption. He quickly motioned for the men to stop before they could reach for the berries. He guided them back a bit before scratching up the ground with a foot. Plucking a branch from a tree, he scratched what he hoped were legible instructions into the dirt. He drew a bush with dots the berries and then split the bush into 3 with some lines. Above one section he scratched out a bird, another a smaller bush, and finally the third section he scratched a stick figure. He turned back to the men hoping they got the idea. Stain stared at the sketch like it was another language Flecht was trying to interpret, and Nobu just stared blankly. After some confused staring, Nobu perked up. "Oh, I get it. We leave a lot for the plant and birds and only take a little." Nobu chirped, happy when Izuku gave him an eager thumbs up. Nobu beamed, turning to the other men with an eager grin. The men seemed to pout that they weren't getting the praise, but they didn't fight over it at least. Now Izuku let them approach the berry bush. Izuku sighed and leaned back against a tree. He watched closely as the men started to pick berries for him. Maybe this godly position wasn't too bad. They certainly listened to him better. Instead of treating him like a source of food and water, they seemed to actually want to learn. A little piece of him was still guilty, given he was all but tricking them. But this will help everyone's survival. The more of these men who knew how to survive, the better off their little group would be. And it's not like he claimed to be a god, they just came up with the idea and he didn't tell them no. Soon enough they returned to camp with the berries. Izuku happily mixed them into the mash and set the metal over the fire. He flattened the stuff out into small discs, almost like burger patties. Though he didn't plan to put it on bread, he was just making portions. Soon the acorn and berries cooked into something resembling pancakes, the smell summoning each man on the island. Izuku let the discs burn a little on the bottom, just enough to caramelize them together so they could be picked up. Then, after letting it all cool down, he let the men at it. Izuku proudly watched the men eat, knowing that at least 3 of them knew how to make it now. As he watched, he noticed a handful of the discs left. He picked up one for himself before looking around. Surely someone had gotten their portion, right? He'd made 1 portion for each of them. Who wasn't eating? Soon he spotted Aizawa. The hero was staying back, only watching from the home's doorway. He seemed hesitant to join the feeding frenzy. Izuku raised the hand with the disc, waving the man over. He smiled as Aizawa noticed, before carefully starting his way over. He kept a wary eye on the villains as they ate, but soon came close enough Izuku could hand over the portion. "Thank you, Gaia." Aizawa quietly thanked him. Izuku nodded, hoping he was just using the name as a name, and not a godly one. The man nodded back before slipping away and back into the home again. So, Wolfram suddenly spoke. He earned most of their attention right away. "You going by that now, Gaia?" Izuku stiffened as everyone's eyes landed back on him. But he nodded. Wolfram huffed but made no further comment. It seemed it was set, Izuku was now Gaia. Izuku returned from the old camp with the animal pelt. The animal had been killed a day or so ago, but its fur had only now dried. It would be good insulation as a door or a blanket Izuku hadn't picked yet. Izuku brought the skin into the camp, laying it out over the stone he'd worked the acorns on the day before. He considered using a stone to prepare it but thought of a better option. A knife would work far better than a random rock for this task. Moreover, this was another chance to teach some of the men how to work. The hide was stiff as a board for the moment. He laid it first side down on the large stone. Then, Izuku waited. He knew his followers would soon notice his return and come to him. Sure enough, they did. Flecht rose from the camp. He'd been cleaning out the fire pit. It was a job he handed off to Gentle in favor of seeing what Izuku was up to. Stain woke from a nap at home, pushing past other sleeping forms to come over. Nobu had been doing something in a nearby field. Nobu all but skipped over when he noticed Izuku. As they gathered around, Izuku pulled out the multi-tool he'd confiscated from Wolfram. Stain seemed surprised when Izuku pulled it out of Black Whip. Luckily, Nobu recognized the item as his leader's, cutting the idea that Izuku could make stuff like Momo out of Stain's mind. Calling back their attention, Izuku started work. He scraped and scraped at the hide, slowly cutting away dried flesh until only skin and fur were left. The pelt was much more pliable in that area now. Satisfied with his demonstration, Izuku passed the blade to Stain. The man gave him a confused look until Izuku guided him closer to the hide and motioned to it. "All right." Stain hummed. He did his best to copy, needing a correction now and then. Once he'd cleaned a section, he had Stain pass the blade to Nobu. Once Nobu knew how to do it, Flecht got a turn. Soon they started a rotation, getting better at the job each turn. Izuku happily watched them work. Yet another skill they could now do on their own. Izuku encouraged them all to stay as he went off to do something else. With a multi-hour task being done, Izuku had some free time to do a different task. He let out a long sigh and cracked his back. "All right. What needs doing now?" Izuku decided to check their food reserves. He entered the home, stepping over sleeping bodies. As lazy as it might appear the men were being, Izuku had guided them to rest. If they were awake and wandering, they might get themselves hurt or sick, like how Nobu almost ate poisonous berries. Until he could be sure they were going something safe, he rather they are resting. It also ensured that if he did need them, they would be well rested. Izuku came to the back wall, where the pile of leaf-wrapped food was stored. As he picked up some meat and gave it a careful sniff, he realized it had spoiled for sure. He sighed and started tucking the meat under his arm. He'd have to dispose of it far from camp. Checking the other foods proved they were still safe, so he left them. He thought about how Chimera had mentioned a food shed. That wasn't a bad idea at all. It would keep any rotting food away from the sleeping group too. Something that might make everyone sick. He left the home and camp, wandering off into the woods. He planned how to make a food shed as he walked and walked. Soon he passed the birch and oak trees, stumbling upon open grassland. He stopped to stare. There were the animals Chimera hunted. He watched them as they grazed in the distance, using their short trunks to pluck leaves from the ground. They stood just over the grass, their tan pelt with faint stripes making them melt into the fields. They walked among the grasses like horses, grazing more like cows. It was a sight that melted something in Izuku. He found himself sitting down at the forest edge but suddenly he felt wrong. His skin prickled and he stiffened. He turned to the source of the feeling, spotting a set of eyes. Forward-facing eyes set right on him. He was carrying meat. Like an idiot, Izuku stared back at the eyes, watching. He dared to look for the rest of the animal. It was crouched in the tall grass. It looked to have fur. Its nose looked like a dog's. Most likely it was canine. The animal blinked at him, moving forward an inch. Izuku turned to it fully, rising to his feet. Suddenly the animal sat up but didn't attack. It looked confused. It must have thought he was a wounded animal, not to mention it probably never saw a human before. It tilted its head at him, sniffing at the air. Izuku stared back as it eyed him. Good, it was too confused to attack. But it was already connecting him with the smell of food. If he ran, its prey drive would kick in and it would chase him. And only prey ran, he might as well just tell it he's prey. Izuku touched a hand to the meat under Black Whip. It might work. The canine flinched as a slab of meat fell between its feet. Even so, it didn't run, it just leaned in for a sniff. After a moment it liked the meat up. It laid down to chew the food as it kept an eye on Izuku. "There we go," Izuku spoke to it. Its ear perked up at the sound, taking it in as it chewed. "Don't eat me and I give you food, win-win." Izuku smiled. Izuku dared to step closer and reach another slab of food closer, tossing it between its paws. This piece was liked up too, crunching between its teeth. As it chewed, Izuku noticed its teeth. It was a meat eater, but it also had molars. A little curious, Izuku glanced around. There were some acorns about the tree edge, so Izuku picked one up. He tossed the nut to the canine and it took it. The nut was quickly crushed between its molars and swallowed with the rest of the food. Omnivore. Maybe it could prove useful. Izuku considered keeping the animal around. It would prove useful for food disposal. Not to mention just having it around might keep other predators away. Most predators stayed away from others' hunting grounds. Izuku watched as it sat up and licked its lips. It was rather cute. It looked small enough to manage too, coyote size at most. Maybe it was a coyote. No, those lived in packs. This thing was alone. Plus it looked kind of like a dog. The colors looked more like a dog at least. Moreover, it looked sickly. He could see its ribs. There were old wounds on his legs, a far fresher one on its neck. It didn't look like a threat now that it wasn't hidden by the grass. It tilted its head at him, looking eager but not aggressive. Seemed it was a fast learner. Suddenly the animal turned. Izuku followed its gaze. Several little eyes stared at him through the grass. To say everyone was a little spooked upon Izuku's return is an understatement. Almost everyone locked onto the small canine limping behind him. Izuku was quick to calm them down, waving them back. The coyote looked nervous at the sight of so many humans, but it followed Izuku anyway. Its injuries were making it desperate for any food, even if that food came with risk. Honestly, it was probably only a matter of time until it found their camp anyway. Far better they meet like this and not in the middle of the night as it tried to get to their food storage. As he and the animal came close to the fire, Izuku dumped all the expired meat, which the coyote happily pounced onto. The moment its pups ran out of the grass and to their mother, the villains visibly softened. The villains watched from a safe distance as the mother coyote chewed the meat, spitting some out that its puppies happily chewed on. There were 4 of the pups, all a little different. As Izuku watched the coyotes and the curious villains, he saw names already being planned. Chimera was the first to claim a puppy as his, gruffly pointing out a pup with a large white spot on its face. I call the snowy-mouthed one, he has my muzzle. Izuku held back a chuckle as a bit of an argument formed. It was decided whoever came up with a good name for a pup had a claim on that pup. Izuku was glad he brought the coyotes home. They were already improving the attitude of his group. Snowmaw. Chimera huffed proudly, ignoring Stain's argument that the name Essie. It is accurate, therefore good. The puppy in question sneezed before looking at its apparent owner. See, he likes it. Stain grumbled as he eyed the other pups. Mummy beat him to it, quickly naming one. He pointed to a rusty-colored pup with a single gray ear. AKA. Stain snapped. That just means red. Mummy glared at the man. So? It is red. 2 puppies had been claimed, 2 were left. Izuku smiled as the 2 now coyote owners tried to start talking to their claimed canine. Chimera's Snowmaw pawed toward the man, raising a paw as if to play. Kai just watched from beside Izuku, not attempting to claim one. When Izuku gave him an encouraging look, he raised the stumps of his arm. Like I'd be able to care for it. Plus dogs are messy. The man faked a GG. Izuku nodded. That was reasonable and responsible. Izuku perked up, surprised to see Aizawa approaching the group. He eyes the little claim party going on with confusion. Luckily Gentle took the time to catch the man up to speed. I'd rather have a cat. Aizawa admitted. Unfortunately for him, a puppy with a dark gray coat all put ran to him. Aizawa stumbled back as the puppy started yapping at him. Izuku smiled, stopping Stain as he tried to claim the pup. Gentle laughed as he nodded. I think Gaia is right, Stain. I think that one picked its owner. Aizawa sputtered. I don't want it. I don't even like dogs. Besides, when we get rescued it's not like I could take it home. Silence fell over the group. Izuku mentally cursed his teacher, but at the same time, he understood. The man wanted to go home because unlike most of these villains, he had a home to return to. Izuku sunk a little, he wanted to go home too, but thinking about it wouldn't go any good. It would just lead to misery. Izuku set a hand on Stain's shoulder, giving him an encouraging push toward Aizawa and the pup at his feet. Stain seemed to hesitate before relenting. The mood was a little sour as Stain knelt to get the pup's attention. The villain called the animal over with a soft voice, earning him a happy puppy at his feet. How about Ashichan? The other villains accepted the name, even if it was a little cliché. The 4th and last puppy was still by its mother's side, liking at the wound on her neck. It whined to the mother, earning a comforting lick in return. Izuku watched the exchange as the naming started again. She seemed tired and weak. Not to mention the walk back to camp appeared to take a lot out of her. Her wounds were puffy and swollen. The hooves of those grazing animals came to mind. She must have tried to kill one for her and her pups and gotten hurt in the process. Izuku let out a long sigh and came to her side. She flinched but allowed him to touch her. The fact she was allowing him this close wasn't a good sign. It was like she was moments from giving up completely. He stroked behind her ears, earning a sigh from her. Distantly Izuku wondered if she used to have a mate, maybe that hunt had claimed him. After all, he couldn't imagine her daring to take that thing on alone. He would try to save her. He couldn't promise himself that he would succeed, but he would at least try. Kai, despite his disgust, did eventually give in to Izuku's pestering. As favor, helped the man wash out his mouth. After all, he had to all but bite the coyote to heal her wounds. He also learned what Nobu had been doing, collecting mint. Izuku wasn't sure what kind of mint it was, but it sure was mint. Izuku held Kai by the jaw as he scrubbed the mashed mint leaves against the man's teeth. Finally, the man was satisfied and pulled away. Izuku helped him wash out with a cup of water. Kai spat the minty water into the grass with a sign. Kai gave him a look that held annoyance but also thankfulness. From now on, if you make me do something gross, I expect a wash. Izuku nodded without reluctance. He knew full well how much Kai hated filth. Even so, Izuku did his best to motion his thanks. The villain nodded with a sigh. It was deep, but not deep enough to hit anything serious. She might feel itchy for a few days, but she is healed. Kai elaborated as he got to his feet. He broke into a wide yawn. I'ma take a quirk nap. Izuku let him go in favor of watching the mother coyote. Her last puppy was still by her side, sniffing the space where her wounds used to be. As the pup noticed the disappearance, its tail started to wag. They happily trotted to their mother's face, liking her cheeks. The mother yawned at the affection, eventually giving the pup licks in return. Shortly she sat up, eyeing the spots herself. She seemed to stretch her once wounded leg in surprise. She turned to him with shock. He whispered low enough only she and her pup could hear. We'll protect you and your babies if you stay. But if you run off when we aren't looking, I won't blame you one bit. Despite his words, she stood, walking closer to him, shutting her eyes, and putting her forehead against his chest. He froze at the touch. Slowly he reached for her head, scratching behind her ears. She easily leaned into the touch, eyes closed as she sat back down. Izuku and the mother coyote jumped as someone suddenly ran up to them. The momentary panic left as Izuku spotted Flecht proudly holding up the animal pelt. I finished it. The man beamed. He stepped forward before handing over the pelt. It's clean from head to toe. Izuku nodded as he took the pelt, testing it with a stretch. Now it was nice and flexible. The mother coyote sniffed it over too, particularly to hooves. Izuku was quick to pop the hooves off the pelt, letting the coyote take them in her jaws. He smiled at Flecht as he walked over to the home. He looked inside to the sleeping men, then the doorway. After thinking for a moment, he decided the pelt would make a good door. It would protect more people as a door. If he tossed it in as a blanket, people might fight over it. It took a bit to figure out how to attach it, but eventually he found piercing it with branches and then weaving said branches into the top of the doorway worked fine. Izuku tested it once or twice before letting it be. He turned away from the door, surprised to see the last pup pawing at a Flecht who couldn't feel it. Izuku fought a laugh, the past users chuckling with him. Flecht went from shock to confusion at Izuku's reaction. Eventually, Izuku pointed out the pup and Flecht finally realized his tiny admirer. The man smiled and crouched to the pup's level. What are you up to? The man grinned, and the pup started running circles around him. Why aren't you a sweet thing? Izuku watched as the man lifted the pup, becoming a little confused at how Flecht seemed to examine it. Gaia, do you know of any human settlements nearby? Flecht suddenly asked. Izuku shook his head. But Flecht just held up the coyote with a confused look. He looked like a Cretan hound. Izuku tilted his head confused. He looked the pup over more. Was it a dog? Honestly, Izuku couldn't tell. He was a quirk nerd, not a dog nerd. Maybe from a feral population, but these certainly look like the dogs from my homeland Greece. Flecht elaborated. Izuku felt like an idiot. As he stared at the very clear dog, he felt more and more stupid. It looked more like a greyhound than a coyote. Izuku wanted to smack himself over the head with a rock. Their tail even curled over their back. Izuku groaned and sat on the ground, digging his hands into his head. How could he be so stupid? He sat up again, much to Fleck's surprise. He needed to scour the island for signs of human life. Now, Izuku was no fool. He knew if he just walked off without a map he'd get lost and possibly die. Then the group might die without him. He couldn't allow that to happen. So, Izuku's first step was to return to the ruins of the prison ship. He wanted to see if there were any useful maps on board. If not, then maybe some paper he could draw his own map on. The sun was blinding today, but as he stared into the ship he saw nothing but darkness. Its thick metal hull allowed no light in at all. He'd have to produce light. Luckily he had a far safer option than a flame. He started up OFA, the crackle of energy producing dim, but effective light. He dared to enter the rusting mass of the boat. Its toppled posture forced him to walk on what were once walls as if they were a floor. He kept float activated, not wanting to risk falling rough the surface. He reached the prison block first. Thick doors laid open, some torn straight off the hinges. Izuku shuddered at the memory. He'd been the one to damage most of the doors. He had refused to let the men sink with the boat. Luckily many other heroes agreed. The prisoners had been too afraid of the sea to fight them. Puddles of seawater filled most of the halls and rooms. It had grown musty and sour in the dark. Finally, he left behind the empty cell blocks. He moved to the heroes' quarters. Not much was left behind. What did remain was now unusable. Izuku pulled a soggy medic bag from the foul water. He dared open it. Luckily some of the items inside were in bottles, protecting them. He took them, pocketing them inside his black whip cover. The rest of his search proved the same. Almost everything was soggy and ruined. Only when he reached higher in the boat, where the captain would have been, were things still dry. The broken windows probably had an effect, as they allowed the sun in. He shut off the crackling light of OFA, settling down to look about. He had found a map, but it didn't have what he was looking for. Even so, Izuku tested the paper with a stretch, finding it was in good condition. He could draw a map on its blank back. Turning it back around allowed him to guess their approximate location. It seemed Fleck had made a good guess from the dogs alone. They were in the Mediterranean Sea. Izuku could see a barely visible landmass in the top corner labeled Greece. If Izuku remembered correctly, they had been transporting the prisoners somewhere in Turkey, so they must have crashed not too far from the source. Plus, not too far from the mainland. It was only a matter of time before they were located, the massive ship plenty enough of an eye-catcher. Izuku glanced over at the ruined devices around the room. He doubted they were reparable, and even if they were, Izuku didn't think he could get anyone to agree to do it. This island was the most freedom the prisoners could get. Izuku tucked the map away as he stood. He promptly OFA flicked at a window, clearing it of glass before slipping out it. He floated to the ground and started his way back to camp. Most of the villains tried to come along with Izuku. He was a little surprised at their eagerness, but he refused. His little following wanted to go the most, but he denied them. They knew how to feed the others. He needed them to stay. Even so, they came to their own choice. They outright stood in his way when he tried to leave, saying one of them needed to go as well, for safety. As annoyed as Izuku was, the past users pulled him to look over the group. Everyone was making a good point. Surviving as a group was far easier than alone. His first choice, Flecked because he couldn't get hurt if he tried, was off the table. He was one of the ones who knew how to care for the group. Not only that, he clearly had a medical history. If anyone was to get hurt, Flecked needed to be there. Kai was for most of the same reason, that and the lack of arms and tendency to get disgusted easily. If he ended up in some gross landscape, the man would probably refuse to go further, and if he had to climb? Kai was nimble, but not to the extent needed to climb without arms. Gentle was a close second to Flecked. His ability to soften any blow and all but bounce away a danger was good. But he was also a wonderful peacekeeper within the group. If a fight were to arise, Gentle would be the best aside from himself to stop it. Mummy was similar. While he wasn't good at talking people down, He was great at restraining them with his quirk. Not only that, he and Kai seemed to be getting closer and closer. Izuku had a feeling they were a package deal now. Wolfram still had a solid limp, and Stain was in a similar state after his late-night dip. Both wouldn't be able to travel the probably harsh terrain they might come across. Nobu was one of the ones too afraid to go, though he did apologize to Izuku for it. Izuku didn't hate him for it, who knows what dangers might be out there. That left Aizawa and Chimera. Aizawa understandably wasn't all that willing to walk off with an unknown villain. After all, if Izuku got hurt, the villains would blame Aizawa. And if Izuku went after Aizawa? The man was all alone with an apparent Kami at his heels. He was a proud hero, but he didn't let his pride get in the way of logic. As far as he knew, Izuku was a threat or a reason for the group to kill him. So, Chimera was Izuku's choice. The man was big, strong, and all but built for the wilderness. So, it was decided. Izuku pointed a finger at the man, selecting him off the group, blocking him from leaving. The man shut his eyes with a nod before turning to the rest of the group. I will try to keep Gaia safe from harm. Is there anything I must know before we depart? Chimera growled to the group of men. Nobu hesitantly raised his hand as if he was in class. Well, Chimera huffed. Can you get some meat before you go? Nobu avoided Chimera's gaze as he made the request. Izuku watched, a little surprised, as Chimera turned to him. He gave the man a nod, one he returned. Chimera crossed his arms and looked back to the group. Gaia will allow me to hunt meat before we leave. Anything else? Kai of all people spoke up. What kind of canine are you? Wolf dash. I'm human, you dumbass. Chimera snapped. Izuku showed Nobu and the others some more skills as they waited for Chimera to finish his hunt. Izuku watched as Nobu carefully used Wolfram's multi-tool. The sharp blade made short work of splintering animal bone. Once Nobu had done it, he began the next step. He took a shard to the rocks and began dragging it back and forth across the stone at an angle. Soon after much dragging, the bone came to a sharp point. Nobu and the others started their own. Izuku watched as Aizawa scrubbed a bone shard against the rocks. He couldn't help but notice how the man seemed to know what he was doing. Izuku narrowed his eyes at the movement, watching as Aizawa dragged not only the shard tip but one side. He was making a knife. Izuku smacked Aizawa's hands, making the man snap out of his focus with a jump. The man glared before Izuku quickly pointed him to the home. They were making the bone splinters to shove into the walls, to deter anything that might try and force a wall down. Izuku had seen the big animals in the field, and he didn't doubt that they could push the home over if they wanted. With the group hunting them, who says they might not come for revenge when they see that their hunter isn't around? Izuku smacked down his own shard, pointing out how it was just a point. Aizawa glared at the item but obeyed. Izuku leaned back with a sigh. He hoped the man was just making it for self-defense and not something violent. Even so, he could tell his teacher was upset at being caught. Even more so because Nobu giggled at him being corrected. To even the score, Izuku lightly shoved Nobu's shoulder for laughing. Izuku eyed Aizawa as he worked the bone shard again, keeping to only its point. Good, Izuku leaned over, rewarding the man with a pat. The man silently nodded, still avoiding his eyes. As he worked, Izuku motioned to Flecht. The man noticed, looking to him for instruction. Izuku quickly pointed 2 fingers to his eyes, to Flecht, then to Aizawa. After a moment to think, Flecht caught on. He nodded, copying the motion between himself and Aizawa, to which Izuku nodded. If Aizawa were to try something, Flecht would be best to deal with it. Even if Aizawa was able to disable his quirk, could Aizawa do that? Or would the quirk reflect off Flecht like everything else did? Flecht was far bigger and far stronger. Not only that, he had a smart mind. Izuku dared say the man was at his teacher's level. Finally, Chimera had returned. Flecht and Gentle got right to preparing it much like last time. Izuku motioned for the rest of the men to begin tapping the bone shards into the wood frame of the home. The hounds were happily lazing about, begging for anything that either group would give them. Chimera came to Izuku's side, smelling like fresh mint. Izuku looked up at the man, motioning to his nose. Chimera's ears twitched as he recognized the question. Kai said I should wash my mouth before we go. Chimera huffed. Izuku nodded. That was a good idea. He should do it too. He sauntered off to do just that. As Kai motioned to the plants to use, Izuku stuffed the meds he had found into the villain's pockets. Kai was the least likely to over-medicate himself. After all, he'd need help to even open the bottles. Kai still looked at him confused, to which Izuku just shrugged. Kai scoffed but allowed the pocket stuffing to happen. With everything that he could account for accounted for, Izuku was ready. He prepared a pencil out of fire charcoal and a twig. He and Chimera started by mapping out everything they knew, the birch and oak grove, the ship and the shore it crashed on, and even the field of wandering herbivores. As Izuku roughly scratched the pencil onto the page, he felt Chimera looming over his shoulder. Izuku paused mid-sketch to look up at the man. Chimera grunted, pointing a bird-like talon to the boat. Make the nose rounder and the back flat. Chimera critiqued. Izuku blinked but then looked back to the page. That might make it look more like a boat than a blob. Izuku rubbed out the picture and tried again. This time when he looked at Chimera, the man nodded. Much more boat-like. Chimera hummed as he nodded. Izuku nodded back with a thankful look. After he prepared to put the pencil on the page again, he considered an idea. He offered Chimera the page. Chimera blinked owlishly at him. Finally, he got the gesture. Are you sure? He asked. Izuku shrugged but persisted with the offer. Chimera carefully took the page and pencil in hand. Izuku craned his neck to watch as Chimera began to sketch. The man even makes rough tree shapes, resembling birch and oaks. The grass field rendered by Chimera looked like an actual field of rolling ground, not the lumpy mess Izuku had drawn. Izuku found himself hopping a little with a giddy clap. Izuku swore Chimera puffed his chest out a little as he held the page down so Izuku could see. Izuku eagerly looked it over. It was so detailed. There were even tiny whiny stick figures in the camp. Izuku's excitement shifted as he noticed the unmistakable outline of a coffin by the boat. He sank a little as he touched the image. He'd been so caught up in everything that he forgot that not everyone who landed had lived. Chimera looked at him with worry, but Izuku shook it off. He stepped back with a deep breath. He wouldn't let another person die, no matter what. Chimera silently watched him with worry still in his eyes as Izuku tried to put on a brave face. Birch and oak groves split by fields and ponds, a repeating sight. It all melted together. Luckily they did have a map. If not, Izuku was sure they would have gotten lost. Luckily there were things of note that Chimera managed to sketch down landmarks. Like a grove of random olive trees in unnaturally neat lines that suggested someone had farmed the fruit there. But with closer inspection, the trees were growing out of control. Their young saplings sprouted up in the paths between the rows. Clearly, someone hadn't tended the farm in a long time. Another landmark was a lake with withered nets stuck in the mud. There were remains of a stone foundation nearby, but it had a worrying dent. So did much of the landscape, random deep divots inside the ground. Chimera had drawn 11 of them already. Luckily no one had been showing signs of radiation sickness, so nuclear tests could be ruled out. But maybe it was bomb testing? No, the fact that had clearly once been a farmhouse got hit. Told of something more natural. Thinking of the region they were in, Izuku came to one conclusion. Volcanic activity. Volcanoes spewed much more than lava. They hissed out poisonous gases and launched stones the size of homes. There had to be a volcano nearby. Izuku prayed it was inactive. Izuku dug around another broken foundation, looking for anything that might date the eruption. This building had been blown completely flat, most likely from a gas flow. Digging around he started to find pockets of ash, all but confirming his theory. He pinched the ash between his fingers, finding it sharp. Volcanic ash was just that, more like sand than ash from a fire. He sighed and kept digging as Chimera drew the area. Under the rotting wood was nothing. Izuku didn't know what to expect. The wood itself was just wood splinters. It had all been claimed by soil and plants. But maybe not. Izuku noticed a metallic shine in the rich soil. Digging it out he found his hands on a coin. He flipped it around in his fingers, trying to find a date. He couldn't find one. With a sigh, he looked the coin over for any clues. He had to squint to see anything at all. But the shapes started to come to him. There was a woman's profile on one side with jewelry in her hair. The other side was what looked like a crude owl. 3 Greek letters were beside it, along with some fruiting branches. It looked old and felt even older. He glanced over the crushed structure, feeling that it needed to be left alone. He tucked the coin back where he'd found it. If they ever got off the island, Izuku might mention that a possible historical site might be there. But if he could help it, no one would disturb the locations. Reburying everything he dug up, Izuku left the spot alone. Some long flattened homes, some dense, and a possibly active volcano within threat distance. That was all the island had to offer them in history. Well, maybe not all it could offer. The olive grove was fruiting. But Izuku had no idea how to process olives. Much less if they were safe raw. Still, Izuku brought a handful back to camp. Not to eat them, but to ask Flecht if they could be eaten. Well, technically they can be eaten raw, but it requires a strong mouth and stomach. Flecht said as he scratched his chin. Izuku passed him the fruit handful, letting the man examine them closer. Flecht did just that, eyeing the fruit with a scrutinizing gaze. A week of soaking in water, they can be stored in brine for the rest of their shelf life. Flecht hummed, daring a small bite. The man instantly winced at the taste. The longer in the brine, the more tender and palatable. The man scowled as he spat the olive out. Izuku held in a laugh as Flecht made a face much like a kid eating something sour. I recommend you let them ripen from this state. Depending on the strain, they might be purple or black, but they will be far more edible at that stage. Though they will still need curing, they will be far more tender and less nutty. Flecht elaborated as he handed Izuku back the fruit. Izuku nodded, quickly tossing the olives into the tree line. He didn't want anyone eating something they needed a strong stomach for. The cured olives, however, would make excellent stored food. Izuku would just need to come up with something to store them in. His and Chimera's return was late in the day. After a rather good meal provided by a proud Nobu, everyone started wandering off to bed. Izuku watched everyone settle in, helping a few pillow their leaf bedding. The puppies followed in next, tucking into arms for warmth. As Izuku counted heads, he noticed 2 missing. Aizawa and the mother dog. Izuku looked out the home's pelt door, worried. Flecht hadn't told him anything about Aizawa's behavior. Hopefully, that meant he didn't get into anything bad. Izuku finished blanketing Gentle before slipping over to the door. Izuku noticed how several of the men watched after him, no doubt wondering why he wasn't settling down for bed too. Izuku motioned for them to sleep, which they obeyed. Still, he could see a few peeping eyes. Sliding out the pelt door, Izuku began to search. He couldn't see the man right away in the darkening area. He did, however, spot the mother dog. She stood right in front of him, blinking up at him. He moved to her level to offer a pet, but she avoided the touch. She turned right around and took a few steps in a direction, before turning her head to look at him. She must know where Aizawa was. So he followed her. She trotted at an even pace into the tree line, sparing Izuku a glance now and then, but marching on. Eventually, she stopped and looked up. Izuku followed her gaze, surprised to see his teacher. The man seemed to have turned his capture scarf into a hammock of sorts. From this far down, Izuku couldn't see his condition. So, worried for the man's health, he floated up to the man. Soon he was looking over the man's sleeping form. He had a thick blanket of oak and birch leaves and what looked to be his sleeping bag. Izuku leaned in unbelieving. Had his teacher really hidden away such a valuable resource from the group? Izuku could understand wanting to keep something that belonged to you, but these were extraordinary circumstances. Apparently, his growing anger was enough to wake his teacher. The man woke slowly before going stiff as stone. Izuku's heated glare landed on the man's wide eyes. His teacher's shock turned into something protective quickly. Though, he wasn't exactly in a position to fight. Izuku flicked a web of black whip under and over the man, cocooning him in place. He squeezed the man hard, earning a grunt. "What is your problem?" Aizawa tried to growl. Izuku tightened his grip with black whip, forcing the man to focus on breathing and not words. Izuku slipped a hand into the man's confines, finding the zipper to the sleeping bag. After a moment he ripped the warm yellow item from his teacher with a glare. He huffed angrily before snapping around with one for all, ripping him from the tree. Izuku ignored the growing protests as they floated back to camp. He all but threw the man inside the home, the mother dog jumping in after him. Only then did Izuku toss the sleeping bag inside. He settled in quickly beside the item, taking loose leaves in the home and stuffing it full. Aizawa glared but made no move to stop him. The waking crowd of villains watched with interest as Izuku zipped close the item. Finished, Izuku patted it down and tucked it against a wall. When he turned back to the group, everyone flinched, clearly aware of his anger. Izuku melted a little, letting out a long sigh. Then he moved to the nearest man. It happened to be Mummy. He was a little nervous as Izuku guided him to lay his head on the sleeping bag. The villain relaxed the moment he laid his head on it. Mummy quickly motioned over Kai, who settled in beside his companion. Eventually, everyone was laying their heads on the soft surface. Aizawa had his arms crossed and wore a not-so-hidden pout. Izuku only gave him a stern look before holding out a hand. After another glare, the hero gave up his capture scarf. Izuku tucked it away for safekeeping before tossing the newer animal pelt over the group. The massive hide covered even Wolfram and Chimera. Izuku went around the edges, making sure to tuck everyone under the hide. No more sore necks for his group. Izuku finally broke into a yawn, settling his eyes on his teacher's capture scarf. That would make a good enough pillow and blanket for his small frame. Izuku landed on the floor for the first time in hours, crawling into the scarf. He pushed and pulled at it until he got it just right, melting into the comfort it provided. Finally, he drifted off with the rest of the men. Aizawa wasn't happy with the group's use of his sleeping bag, that much was clear. But Izuku could see the improvement in the villain's mood already. With cute puppies, a warm blanket, and a literal place to lay their head, everyone just acted healthier. Even Kai, who was even grumpier than when Izuku first met him, seemed to be relaxing more often. Though, it did seem Mummy was helping that along. The pair was attached at the hip at this point. Izuku wouldn't go as far as calling them boyfriends. But honestly, they were rather close. Mummy was in good spirits as well, taking way more than he did pre-bed. So, as grumpy as his teacher was, Izuku had to look at the bright side. Time for breakfast quickly came. This time Stain took the mantle as the cook. He burned the food a bit but no one complained. Food was food and they were hungry. Once finished his meal, he took the time to look everyone over. Nothing too strange, checking for ticks or mites, making sure no one had unexplained bruises or bumps. He was pulling back the prison-issued shirt on Stain when he noticed a mark. He narrowed his gaze at the mark, the fresh morning sun giving him plenty of light to see with. But, even with the light, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. He was careful as he pressed a finger to the mark, noticing how Stain flinched with a hiss. He stopped touching right away but kept staring. A bruise? It looked rather dark. Izuku ended up turning to Flecht for help. He waved the man over, motioning to the mark with a worried sound. Stain stayed silent as Flecht leaned over to look. The blue villain chewed his food with a blank expression as he looked at the mark. Izuku's worry quickly turned into embarrassment. "It's a hickey," Flecht said blankly. Stain stiffened as several people nearly choked on their food. Now, Izuku didn't much care who was doing that, with who. But the fact it had to have been with all of them nearby. Izuku didn't exactly like it. "Now you see why I was in the F tree." Aizawa shot up with a huff, face red. 3 nights I was stuck beside that fucker and dash. Izuku raised a hand to silence the man as he found the other pinching between his eyes. He didn't want to know the SXL habits of these men. His main worry was their health and safety. Besides, what did anyone expect? Multiple grown men known for acting out on their emotions stuck on an island with no other way to vent their urges? It was going to happen eventually. Izuku tugged Stain's shirt collar back into place, glaring at anyone who tried to continue the conversation. Izuku was no idiot. If the men got their energy out in this not-so-dangerous manner, he had no reason to complain. He wasn't new to the idea of people having SEC purely for stress relief either. Living in the dorms with his classmates was far more hormonal than this. At least Stain and his mystery partner had the decency to not be romantic out in the open like a teenager. Izuku continued his health checks, finding nothing of worry. He did, however, have a final point he wanted to make. One that, unfortunately, needed words to get across. So, with the past users speaking with him, he stood in front of the men as they finished their food. No SEC in the house. Everyone was still, frozen in place. Wide eyes stared at him from every direction. Still, Izuku faltered. The activity had gotten his teacher to risk the elements, and it was just gross to think he was possibly sharing a room with that activity. After a moment, everyone acknowledged the rule, faces various shades of red. And strangely enough, purple when it came to Flecht. It was night, early morning technically, but Izuku was awake. He couldn't sleep, constantly shifting in his spot. He simply couldn't get comfortable. So he elected to put his wakefulness to use. Mainly to ease Aizawa and his own stress. Izuku started work on another home. Now that he knew what he was doing, this one should turn out better. The old one stained with God knows what. Would be used for private affairs. Izuku wasn't a monster after all, and doing that in the wilderness isn't exactly safe. So, Izuku scratched a foundation out on some new rock. This patch of exposed stone was a bit further from the one the original home sat on. So it should give ample privacy to any pair sneaking off to hook up. The mother dog watched him work, much to his amusement. At this hour, she usually was cuddled up to the men. But Izuku's sounds must have piqued her interest. He would scratch at the stone with black whip threads, and she'd slant her head in curiosity. Soon though, Izuku had the spot cleared off. Construction went much the same as before. This time Izuku thought of building shelves into the walls. That was a bit harder than he planned it to be. He ended up giving the shelf supports from the floor. In all honesty, it resembled a cramped cage, not a shelf. But it was more storage space. Ugly storage space, but storage space all the same. Izuku silently moved nearly everything into the new home not long after. As he tried to pick a good spot for a bed, he noticed Aizawa peering in at him. Izuku turned to the address man, but Aizawa slipped away. But understandable. Izuku was still an unknown villain, after all. Izuku could hear the man's footsteps crunching in the grass as he wandered close to the new site. Soon paws followed many of them. Seemed Aizawa had a little following of puppies. The dogs quickly moved in. They passed right under Izuku as he was packing food atop the shelf. Slipping into the space under the shelf, the dogs lay down, apparently finding it cozy. Their human companion had seemingly snuck back home. As for the dogs, Izuku didn't have the heart to move them. Nor could he fit to chase them out. So, he just resigned and let them settle in. They happily slept the rest of the night away. With a tired body, Izuku found himself following soon after. He lay close to the dogs, letting a hand fall into their area to scratch the mother dog's ears. As he started to drift off, he wondered if anyone knew they were alive. Certainly they would check, right? After all, it had been a ship full of dangerous men and women. They couldn't let them run free, right? But as Izuku stared at the drying mud on the ceiling, he considered a sad idea. What if no one was looking? Suddenly Izuku chuckled. No, one man would be for sure. But maybe it was best for Izuku did stay on lost. All for one couldn't take one for all if it was lost at sea. But what if all for one did find him? The man had all the time in the world after all. Plus, Izuku could really go for his mother's katsudon right now. Maybe even a tussle of his hair from All Might. Rude words from Kaken. A curious glance from Shudo. Maybe even an insult from a Class 1B's Monoma. Izuku finally left the new building once the day broke. He groaned as he broke into a much-needed stretch. There was radiant morning sun greeting him. The air smelled fresh, and a calm breeze carried the scent of flowers his way. He sighed, feeling relaxed at the peaceful aura. He opened his eyes, letting them drift over to the old home. And now the sound of screaming hit Izuku's ears. Izuku found his face turning into a scowl as he took in the sight before him. A panicked Gentle was holding a fighting Stain and Aizawa apart. Flecht sat beside a fireless fire looking ready to kill either man. Mummy was staring wide-eyed at the fight from the home door. Kai was barely visible behind Mummy, looking equally startled. Nobu sat silently and awkwardly beside Wolfram. The larger man had his arms crossed, glaring at his shorter companion. Chimera was nowhere to be seen. One night, and chaos. Izuku sighed to himself as he walked over to the old home. He snapped Black Whip, making attention snap to him. He huffed as he stopped beside the fire, motioning to the fight before landing his hands on his hips. Izawa and Stian went back to glaring, but now they angrily shouted the reason for the fight. Apparently, Stain had gotten a bit touchy last night, and Izawa happened to be sleeping beside him. The affection was not appreciated by far. As to why no one was agreeing completely with Izawa, was because of how Izawa reacted. The hero had shot around and put Stain in a chokehold. The ensuing fight woke up everyone except Izuku, apparently. It was also why Izawa had been wandering last night. No one wanted to sleep beside a choke-happy Izawa. Well, good timing then. After a short effort of half-baked hand motions and sketches in the dirt, Gentle communicated Izuku's plan to the group. The old home was for private affairs only, purely so no one had to do it in the wilderness. But Izuku did expect whoever used the place to clean up after themselves. And as for the new home? Strictly no SXL activity inside. It was a place for sleep and storage only. There were a few growls and pouts, but everyone agreed to the rules. Izuku was stirring an attempt at stew in a pot Wolfram had made when he was approached. Izuku was mid-taste test when a wreath of flowers was held in front of his eyes. Izuku blinked at the colorful weave. He put the spoon back in the stew as he looked up at the apparent wreath maker. Chimera stood before him. The wreath was the size of Izuku's head, but only the size of a bracelet for the massive man. Somehow that fact made the creation impressive. How carefully Chimera would have had to be to make something so small compared to his talents. What? Izuku tilted his head with that exact question. Chimera huffed as if it was obvious. You covered the scent of meat with flowers before, yes? I thought it might do well for the new storage space. As practical as the gift was meant to be, Izuku could see the tips of Chimera's ears turning red. It seemed this was more than a tool. Izuku smiled, taking the item from the man. He passed the cooking duty off to Nobu, who was giving Chimera a knowing look. The walk to the new home was brief, but Izuku could hear Chimera following behind him. As if he needed an SCRT for this journey too. Izuku tucked the wreath onto the shelf, piling some of the wrapped meat into its center. Izuku swore he saw Chimera's tail wagging from the corner of his eye. Everyone seemed to calm down a bit the next day. Izawa wasn't as jumpy and the others weren't acting like they'd be attacked any second. As nice as the change was, it worried Izuku for a moment. Had there been a fight? Had a villain put Izawa in his place? He hoped not. He didn't want anyone fighting, much less his teacher. The last thing he wanted was for the group to turn on his teacher. Izuku was working with Wolfram and Chimera, trying to make suitable storage for the olives. Izuku worked on guiding Wolfram on the needed shape as Chimera watched for the moment. The more animalistic man had found a beehive and taken some of its combs. The honey had been a sweet treat, but the wax would make metal containers safe for food. Izuku watched the metal shudder under Wolfram's quirk. Noticing the man going off course, he reached for his hands, guiding them the right way. Wolfram tensed up but obeyed instantly. Izuku stayed focused on the crude bottle, barely noticing a growling sound. Finally, Izuku did notice, perking up to see if the dogs had found something. Only the mother dog and her pups were lounging quite a distance away. Izuku went right back to work. Eventually, a bottle had been made, now to coat the inside with Max. Izuku stuffed the, now clean and washed, bee comb into the bottle. With Black Whip he started to carefully turn and twist the container, making sure the melting wax coated the inside all over. Gaia, Chimera suddenly spoke. Izuku nodded, eyes never leaving the bottle. Izuku heard Chimera shuffle closer before sitting directly beside him. Chimera seemed to be fighting for words. With worry, Izuku turned to the man. He took Chimera's appearance in. He was fresh from a bath in the lake. He had to take one after getting honey on himself. The tips of his ears were red and he was tapping at his legs with a shaky talon. Izuku tilted his head at the odd behavior. Perhaps he'd gotten stung after all? The man swore upon his return that he hadn't, but maybe he was embarrassed to admit it. Izuku prayed the man wasn't allergic. Did you like the flowers? Chimera finally landed. Izuku had a feeling it wasn't his original question, but he didn't press. Izuku nodded with a smile. With the combination of the flowers and wrapping the meat, he hadn't seen any flies buzzing around their food storage. The wreath was working wonderfully. Good, good. Chimera nodded. Izuku felt the man's snake-like tail shift behind him. The reptilian appendage was twitching back and forth, bumping into Izuku as it did. Izuku couldn't hold back the chuckle that left him. Chimera stiffened immediately, tail going straight as a spear. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dash. Chimera snapped his jaw shut with a click as Izuku smiled at him. Izuku set a hand on the man's massive arm, trying to give him a comforting touch. That seemed to only make things worse. Chimera's ears turned red and went flat against his head. Izuku made a worried whine as the man snapped his head to look away from Izuku. He went to stop the touch, thinking he overstepped when he noticed Chimera's tail wagging. Izuku stared at his reflection. The water's surface made his face move, but Izuku could see it now. Could see why they saw him as a woman. His lean and short frame was now added upon with long dark locks. Staring at the hair, he couldn't help but picture his mother staring back up at him. He took a hand to a chunk of hair, pulling it straight. It looked ever more like his mother's hair like that. It left a sour feeling in his throat. He wanted to see her again. But not like this. Izuku pressed a blade of bone to his hair, ready to cut it all off. He pulled it tight, pressing hard. He started to hear a sound like wires snapping. It was working, he just needed to... You'll cut your throat like that? Izuku startled, hand slipping. Momentary panic stilled into surprise as he felt a hand around his wrist. He swallowed dryly as he eyed it. He could already tell it was Flecht, his mechanical hands a dead giveaway. Izuku felt himself begin to shake as he let go of his hair and the knife. Flecht silently took the blade from him. The silence hung for a moment. Izuku sat shaking by the water's edge, only stopping when Flecht spoke again. May I touch you? Flecht asked so politely. Izuku nodded, fighting a sniffle. Flecht hooked an arm around his shoulder, tugging Izuku into the man's chest. The man laid his head atop Izuku's. Izuku turned to the touch, melting into the man's chest. He started moving his hands to cling to Flecht's worn prison suit. The man leaned down some, letting Izuku cling to him better. Izuku's shaking started to ease up. But he couldn't bring himself to pull away. He forgot how good it felt to be hugged. He could stay like this forever. If you must cut your hair, perhaps I'd be best if I did it for you? Flecht offered, but his tone sounded more like a question. Izuku nodded again. Reluctantly he leaned away from Flecht's embrace. As promised, the man guided him to sit. Flecht sat behind him before taking Izuku's hair in hand. I will admit, other than my own hair I'm not too experienced, Flecht said, leaning to look Izuku in the eye. Is that all right? The man hummed. He looked a little worried as he spoke to Izuku. Izuku nodded and did his best to stay still. With permission granted, Flecht started. Izuku had to admit, Flecht was far better than Izuku at this. He didn't yank or pull. The only thing Izuku felt was his head getting lighter and the tickle of cut hair falling down his back. Soon enough Flecht paused but didn't let go of Izuku's hair. I can try and style it if you'd like. Flecht offered yet again. And yet again, Izuku nodded. Do you have anything in mind? Flecht asked. This time Izuku shook his head. All right, how about a little bit of an undercut? It is getting warmer and warmer, and your hair is so thick. Flecht hummed, looking over Izuku's shoulder at the water's surface. Sounds nice, Izuku said without thinking. Flecht didn't mention it, but Izuku did notice a purple gleam on the man's face. Undercut it is then. As promised, Izuku now sported an undercut. Izuku touched the short fuzz hidden under the rest of his hair. It was rather thick. Even so, Izuku felt notably lighter, and his head felt a little less warm. Izuku smiled as he tousled his new haircut. He liked it like this. He'd have to wear it like this more often. Izuku turned to Flecht with a grin, one that made the purple on Flecht's face spread. Well, Safe to say you like it? Flecht asked. Izuku nodded eagerly. He turned around in his spot before trapping the larger man into a tight hug. Flecht returned it quick enough, tucking his head over Izuku's shoulder. I'm glad you approve, Gaia. Izuku watched in amusement as nearly everyone lined up for a haircut. Poor Flecht seemed to be the resident barber now. But the man took it in stride. He was working on Kai's growing stubble when lunch began. It was Izuku's turn to cook again. This time around, they had a new item at the table. It was some sort of grain, one that Nobu had helpfully harvested for the group. There had been several attempts at bread, and finally, they seemed to have worked it out. So, Izuku was putting the finishing touches a raw dough. It was already in a loaf-shaped container, curiously of wolfram of course, it just needed some additions. Izuku carefully drizzled some leftover honey atop the bread, then placed some acorn grain across it. It was a recipe Gentel named Acorn Honey Crust Bread. A bit long but accurate. Unfortunately, they didn't have yeast to add fluff, so it was rather dense. But it was still bread. Soon the bread was done, then each slice got a helping of berry jam. It wasn't as sweet as store-bought jam, but it did add a little sweetness. Everyone happily helped themselves to a slice, sitting around the still-burning fire to eat. So, Gentle spoke through a full mouth. Anyone else thinking it needs butter? Several men nodded. Stain was the first to speak up. Those taper things are mammals. Maybe we could keep one for milk. Aizawa snorted. Go ahead and try, but I'm not prying your remains off their hooves. There were several snickers at that. Izuku was happy his teacher had calmed down enough to joke with the villains. Though, he couldn't help but wonder where it had come from. At the same time, Izuku was afraid asking might revert the progress. Gaia, someone asked, earning his attention. It had been Chimera. The man was watching Flecht carefully as he continued. Is there anything you need of me? Izuku blinked, wondering where that came from too. Oh, right. Izuku sighed and shook his head. He returned to his bread hoping the conversation would end there. Izuku was not about to entertain a feud between Chimera and Flecht just because Chimera. How could Chimera like him? He knew almost nothing about him, not even his name. Right? Chimera loved Gaia, not Izuku. Izuku wasn't on this island, only Gaia was. The possible villain/goddess helping the group survive. His attention was ripped back to the present as Stain laughed at Chimera's expense. Talk about rejected. Stain sneered. Like you and Eraserhead? Chimera growled right back. Aizawa choked on his bread as Stain launched to his feet. I'll have you know we FUT dash. And easy talk at eating hours. Izuku snapped with the voices of the past users. Stain flinched, but relented, all but grumpily. He sat back down with a huff and glared in Chimera's direction. Lunch fell silent after that. Everyone seemed afraid to set off a clearly worked-up Izuku. Well, that explains why Aizawa was so relaxed now. Izuku groaned as he leaned over, placing his head in his free hand. He really didn't want to know these men's SEC lives, let alone the SEC life of his own teacher. Perhaps talk of. Flecht began to speak, watching as he did for Izuku's reaction. Flecht was evidently trying to watch his words to not upset him. Intimate things around Gaia, she seems to dislike the topic. Gentle nodded with a look that said, no sheet. Kai's grooming was finally done, and he came to the eating circle. Mummy was quick to grab the man a piece of bread. Izuku couldn't help but watch as Mummy carefully peeled the crust off the slice before feeding it to Kai. It's good today. Kai hummed. A few nods from the group. Could use butter, Kai added. Right? Maybe some heavy cream even dash, Gentle. Started again. The topic returned to food, something Izuku was happy for. He silently thanked Kai for the subject change. Izuku pushed the last of 3 olive jars onto the storage shelf. He stood back, checking them. Happy that they wouldn't fall off, he left the shelter. Another sunrise had ended, and the sun was gleaming just above the treetops. Its rays were heated, hot even. Izuku watched the wandering men as he left the shelter. Many were tugging at their shirts, trying in vain to cool off. Most had found their way into the water for a dip. Izuku stopped in the middle of his walk, hands finding his hips as he watched the men. He had to admit he was in a similar state. Black Whip protected his identity and skin, but it was attracting the sun's heat. Izuku noticed the mother dog teaching her puppies how to swim, no doubt trying to escape the heat as well. It was settled, Izuku needed to do something. Izuku started work instantly, setting up poles of wood. He fought the heat eating at him as he started laying mats of branches across the poles. The sun was starting to all but boil him, its rays soaking into Black Whip. He shifted the quirk, shuddering it to shake some heat off. The moment he stopped, the heat returned. Izuku groaned as he leaned against a pole, his feet threatening to slip out from under him. His hands were shaky as he reached for another mat. He just needed to put it up, then he'd have shade to rest in. Izuku woke up to his teacher over him. He squinted up at the man confused, flinching as something wet touched his forehead. He reached for the offending wetness only for Aizawa to push his hands away. "Relax, you fainted." Aizawa started to explain. "The heat got you, and don't worry about your project. Mummy and Gentle took over, you rest." Izuku took a moment to take in the man's words. He wasn't surprised, but he still didn't like it. He had to work. Aizawa forced him back down as he tried to sit up. "None of that, it's your turn to be taken care of, Gaia." Aizawa hummed as he tugged Izuku back down. Izuku huffed, the sound more like a growl. Yeah, you'll get over it." His teacher growled back. Suddenly someone entered the home. The polite knock had Izuku guessing already. "They're Gentle or? Is she awake?" Flecht asked Aizawa. "She is, and pissy," Aizawa answered. Izuku sent him a growl for that. "Gaia," Flecht began, gathering Izuku's focus. Izuku turned to the man with a pout. Flecht shrunk a bit at the look, but he still came closer. "Please, try to rest, the heat is just too much for you." Flecht sat beside Izuku, taking a wet cloth from Aizawa. The teacher instantly took the chance to leave, leaving the care duties to Flecht. Izuku growled again as Flecht pressed the cloth to his head. "You must rest, Gaia," Flecht seemed to plead. "Please, Dartya." Flecht's face turned purple. Izuku froze, staring up at the man from his spot on the floor. Flecht's face was growing more and more purple by the second. He was avoiding Izuku's gaze now too. Izuku blinked up at Flecht. Had he almost called Izuku darling? Why did the idea not bother Izuku? Izuku tilted his head at the man. Flecht turned away from him with a sigh. "Forgive me, Gaia, I didn't mean to dash." Izuku interrupted the man, rolling over onto his stomach before getting onto his hands and knees. He quickly crawled onto the man's lap, laying across Flecht's lap. The man's stiff posture quickly melted. Izuku closed his eyes as Flecht pulled him close. "And may I call you such?" Flecht asked quietly. Izuku nodded as he nosed into Flecht's chest. "Gaia, my darling," Flecht tested. Izuku purred, enjoying the term. Izuku lay happily in the man's lap as Flecht continued to tend to him. Little dabs of wet cloth on his face to cool him, gentle hugs to keep him comfortable. But part of Izuku felt like this was wrong. Flecht, much like Chimera, loved Gaia. Not him. He couldn't lead the man on like this. Izuku sighed, sitting up in Flecht's lap, and placing his hands on Flecht's shoulders. Flecht looked at him with a mix of worry and curiosity as Izuku stared at him. Izuku prayed that the man's expression wouldn't turn to hate. Izuku let Black Whip fall away from his face. "If knew it." Kai shouted from the lake. Mummy had to catch the man as he nearly fell into the lake's depths. Izuku scratched at his arms awkwardly as the group had varying reactions. He'd given up his identity, not wanting to lie to anyone anymore, not when he'd grown to care for them like family. And some is more. Gentle looked serious like he was examining Izuku. "Well, I can certainly understand why you did yourself now." Stain snorted from the man's side. "No sheet, he probably was afraid we'd gut him." Mummy and Nobu weren't reacting too strongly. It probably helped that Izuku hadn't faced them directly before. Wolfram looked sad at himself for not realizing sooner. The man was angrily counting something on his fingers, probably things that should have cued him to Izuku's identity. Green sparks, eyes, hair. Annoyingly persistent. Then, there was Izuku's teacher. Aizawa was staring at him without a word. He sat down, hands folded and pressed to his lips as his face was stuck into deep focus. His brow twitched now and then. Something Izuku knew was the man holding back anger. Izuku avoided his gaze, not wanting a scolding. Aizawa's stern silence was somehow worse than any stern words he could say. That left Chimera and Flecht. Chimera seemed frozen in surprise. The animal man stood stiff as a board watching Izuku with wide eyes. Chimera tried, but words failed him. Flecht stood beside Chimera, a hand on his mouth and other arms across his chest. He was looking him up and down with a look Izuku couldn't place. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Aizawa finally spoke up, thinly veiled anger in his voice. Izuku looked away from the men. He eyed the scenery as he tried to think. Stain spoke for him though. Are you stupid? Unlike you, he's a student hero still, probably feared we'd gang up and beat his butt. Stain hissed at Aizawa. Izuku shrunk in on himself but nodded. Aizawa sighed but asked another question. Why didn't you tell me then? You are usably with everyone else, or I was in the middle of something important, Izuku admitted. Aizawa groaned, dropping his head into his hands. The hero looked stressed, more than Izuku had ever seen. He felt horrible for causing it, but what else was he supposed to do? Run around asking the villains to fight him? Even so, Izuku felt horrible. He felt like he'd betrayed everyone's trust. Gee, Izuku. Flecht began. Izuku turned to the man, watching as the man stepped closer. Chimera watched Flecht closely as well, a little bit of competitiveness in his wolf-like eyes. Your care of everyone was genuine, yes? Flecht asked, brow turned up with worry. Izuku melted a little but nodded. The reason I went to UA was to save people. No matter who they are. Even villains? Wolfram growled from his spot. Izuku nodded. Even villains. If it helps you to understand why. I once wasn't too far from becoming one. Izuku offered. It did in fact help. Wolfram's caution seemed to break, if only for a second. The man asked another question. What does that mean? Because if you're talking about intrusive thoughts, those don't count. I am sure some of you have heard of muscular? Izuku tried. He looked around, seeing some men nod. He avoided his teacher's gaze as he continued. He was horrible, mocking the child of two heroes he killed, threatening to kill him the same way, and Izuku sat down quickly, fast enough he saw Flecht move to catch him if he was falling. Now seated, he continued. I wanted to do more than catch him, more than kill even. Izuku scratched at his arms as he thought over his words. I wanted him to suffer as he did to those heroes. Wanted him to be even more scared than he made that child. It was the heat of the moment, but, for a moment when he was on the ground, I thought of something. He let out a long sigh, flinching as he caught a glance of his teacher's firm gaze. I thought of many horrible things I could do to him. It was only my worry for my fellow students that made me leave him there. So, Wolfram growled, a little less angrily now. You considered it? Izuku nodded. I hate to say I regret not doing something. Muscular made it clear he gets a thrill from killing. He bragged and tormented others about his murders. He shouldn't have been left with the ability to harm anyone again. Silence fell over the group. Silence Izuku felt under his skin, itching at him to speak. But what was there to say? Do you feel like any of us like that? Mummy asked with worry. Izuku could see the man not so secretly hiding Kai behind him. Izuku shook his head. You all have reasons, good reasons, maybe not good enough to excuse what you did, but it's only men like Muscular that I feel that with. Suddenly the tension in the air melted away. Izuku sat up, confused. What was so relaxing about his urges to mutilate a murder? Izuku, with all due respect. Wolfram snorted. You kicked more than half our buttes a while ago. I may be a bit thick in the skull, but I'm not stupid enough to believe I'm unkillable. Kai huffed. Like any of us could stand a chance if you really wanted us dead. The resounding agreement just confused Izuku further. Izuku found it strange how easily the group took his exposure. It was as if he'd been Izuku the entire time. Why weren't they angry? Why were they not trying to kill him? Why were they not? Is my cooking that bad? Gentle mumbled next to him. Izuku snapped out of his thoughts and turned to the man. No. I just dash. Izuku blinked at the man. Gentle was looking at him with concern. I was lost in thought is all. Izuku continued. Ah, good. Gentle sighed, face relaxing as he returned to his own serving. It was breakfast time the next day. Days on the island had gone by without being counted, so Izuku had no idea how long they'd spent there. A little over a week at least. It felt longer than that, but he had to be rational. He tried counting the days in his head, but they all melted together into a timeless mess. Someone had to have seen the washed-up ship by now. A search party, maybe even a passing plane or ship. The Mediterranean Sea was a busy place, they had to have been spotted by now. So why was no one here? As much as he was delighted he hadn't woken to AFO knocking at his door, he couldn't help but look at his teacher. The villains were happy to be free, but Aizawa seemed to be getting more and more depressed. The hero would never admit it, but Izuku could tell he was missing Mike and everyone else. What stung even more for Izuku was the now common sight of guilt on the man's features. It was like the world was resting on his teacher's shoulders. The man was barely eating now, picking at his food more than eating any. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, or bathed. The man was a mess. But what was Izuku to do? He was able to fulfill his basic needs, but this problem wasn't as fixable as hunger. The man was luckily still mingling with the group, but not often. He was nearly always silent, even Mummy talked more than him now. How was Izuku supposed to help? He didn't know how at all. He could barely handle his own emotions, much less the emotions of another person. He couldn't. Izuku couldn't help. That hurt more than any wound he'd earned. Izuku lay limp in the home. He was staring off into space, not really focusing on anything. A frustrating silence fell over his mind. He blinked at the wall ahead of him, ignoring the sounds of distant chatter. The floor was cold, the chill was more than welcome, however. If it wasn't for the chill keeping him grounded, Izuku felt he just might disappear. My darling. Fleck's voice entered the home. Izuku only grunted in response. My dear, you have been here all day, surely you want some sun? Fleck hummed as he got closer. The man waited for a response from Izuku. When he didn't receive one, the man let out a sigh. Izuku lay still as he heard Fleck lie down beside him. The man quickly pressed his head to Izuku's chest, making him freeze. Deep breath, Fleck ordered. He was checking Izuku's health. Izuku gave into the gesture, taking in a long breath, and letting it out just as slowly. Fleck propped himself up on an arm. He went from staring at Izuku's chest to looking him in the eyes. Just resting? The man asked. Izuku gave him a weak nod before relaxing again. Fleck hummed again. Only the man then tugged Izuku close, wrapping around him. It caught Izuku off guard. Fleck normally asked before touching him. If something is troubling you, please tell me. Fleck sounded so miserable. But had Izuku done something? Had he upset the man somehow? I'm worried you barely looked at me. Izuku felt Black Whip snake out of his skin, wrapping around Fleck to hold him close. Izuku nosed into the man's neck, his hands finding his collar. I'm worried about my teacher, you did nothing wrong, okay? Fleck nodded into his hair. You swear it wasn't something I did? Fleck hummed with a worried tune. Izuku nodded. You've been doing great, all of you have. Fleck nodded again, pulling back just enough to look at Izuku. Your teacher, Eraserhead, he has been acting rather glum, hasn't he? Izuku sighed, nosing back into Fleck's neck. Yeah, he's homesick for sure. Homesick? Are you also? Fleck hummed the question. Izuku nodded. A little, but it might be best I stay lost. Fleck noticeably stiffened. What does that mean? Izuku let out a huff. All for one heard of him? Fleck nodded. He wants me, dead or alive. Izuku elaborated. If I'm lost at sea, he can't hurt the ones I love to get to me. I see. Fleck hummed. So, as much as you miss your companions back home, you plan to stay lost? Yeah, he can't hurt what he can't find, Izuku confirmed. How can you be so sure? Fleck asked. Izuku huffed. Because he's a villain and an attention whore, He'd do anything to upset me if he knew I could see it. If I can't see? He has no reason to hurt the people I love. I'm not there to react to it. Did you just call the most feared villain an attention-whore? Flecht asked flatly. It's not a lie. Izuku grinned. Izuku chewed on a piece of jerky Chimera had prepared. He was considering the taste, but it certainly was dry all the way through. Meaning it was good for storage. Izuku smiled with his full mouth at the animalistic man. Needs a little flavor, but this will store way better than the other stuff. Izuku hummed through the food. Izuku caught sight of Chimera's tail wagging as the man smiled. I will try some herbs on it next time. Chimera grinned. The man's maw was full of intimidating teeth, but Izuku smiled back with ease. He knew Chimera cared too much to use those fangs on him. No matter how intimidating Chimera was, he was a big softy under that thick hide. Izuku knew something was off. He stared at the distant tree-line knowing something was there. He could feel eyes staring back at him, an unwavering gaze. He hadn't been able to shake for hours. He couldn't spot his watcher no matter how hard he searched. More dogs? He could see nothing stalking around in the brush. Some sort of bird? He could see nothing among the tree branches. Whatever it was, it felt predatory. Like it was waiting for his guard to slip so it could catch and eat him. The others felt it as well. They all agreed it was from a single direction as well. It was behind the camp and homes. Izuku considered the idea that it was a state of shared paranoia, but no, that was too convenient. Besides, these men weren't idiots. They were villains who survived some of the most dangerous streets across the world. If anyone could tell the difference between paranoia and something real, it was them. Even so, none of them had spotted a thing. Whatever it was might as well be invisible. Distantly, Izuku considered they'd finally been found. Perhaps it was a hero hiding in those woods, planning a way to catch the villains and rescue Eraserhead and Izuku. It would make sense. After all, they couldn't risk just running in, that could get them killed. So why did it feel so hostile? So aggressive? Izuku glared at the trees, sparing a glance at the setting sun. Once night fell, it would have the best cover for an attack. Izuku didn't want to give it that chance. He turned to the group, watching as they gathered for dinner. This would be his best chance to slip away. With them focused on food, they shouldn't notice his absence. Izuku narrowed his eyes as he looked back to the forest. Whatever it was, he'd take care of it. Now or never. Izuku slipped into the grass, crawling low and slow. He moved all but silently toward the tree-line. Soon he was passing tree trunks and bushes. He looked up, scanning for any threats. The trees swayed in the darkening sky, showing him nothing. The thick brush exposed nothing as he slunk through it. He continued his search until night fully fell. And yet, nothing. He hadn't spotted whatever it was that was stalking the group. He slipped back into camp with nothing discovered. Izuku paused at the sight before him. Standing beside the home's door were Flecht and Chimera. They must have noticed he was gone. Izuku ducked his head, ashamed he hadn't caught the stalker. He walked up to the men with his head down and his hands fidgeting. They must be disappointed. Are you all right? Flecht asked in a careful tone. The man leaned down, catching Izuku's eyes. Why did he look worried? Why yeah. Izuku answered. We were worried you snuck off to vomit to something. Chimera added. The animalistic man stood up from his lean against the home. His crossed arms fell flat at his sides. Chimera leaned down, nose moving as he sniffed at Izuku. Oh, they thought he was sick. The health scare Izuku gave Flecht yesterday probably didn't help. I'm okay, I was just. Izuku motioned to the dark woods. Looking. For what? Chimera growled. Izuku sighed and he slipped between the men and into the home. It doesn't matter, not like I found it anyway. Izuku heard the men whisper something to each other before they followed him in for bed. Izuku toed around the men in the home before finding a spot to rest. As he lay down in his chosen place, Flecht and Chimera found a spot on either side of him. Izuku grunted, a little annoyed, as Flecht and Chimera crushed him between them. The annoyance quickly fell as Izuku found himself cuddling into Chimera's thick fur. The man was also impossibly warm, the temperature all the more wonderful after his walk. Izuku groaned with a stretch before finally melting against Chimera. Izuku woke with a stretch and yawn. His back popped as he stretched, earning a small from him. He worked his tired eyes open, taking in the new day. Most had woken up already, leaving Izuku alone with Chimera and Flecht. The two men were still sleeping as Izuku looked around. Flecht had his arms wrapped tightly around Izuku's waist, his head placed on Izuku's shoulder. Chimera had tugged Izuku onto his chest as they slept, leaving Izuku half on Chimera and partly on the floor. The animal man's heavy tail was curled and tangled with Izuku's legs, the scales it sported itching at Izuku's skin. Izuku relaxed back into the pile for the moment. He wasn't in a rush to do anything, the day could wait. Izuku closed his eyes just in time for Flecht to stir. The man groaned and pressed his face deeper into Izuku's neck. Izuku couldn't help but smile at the sleepy gesture. He reached a hand toward the man, finding his fingers in his short hair. Flecht hummed at the touch, tightening his grip across Izuku's waist. Izuku choked, skirming in the tight grasp. "Careful." He managed to get his tired voice to say. "I'll pop if you squeeze me too hard." He teased. Flecht grunted, nosing up to Izuku's cheek. Izuku giggled, trying to push Flecht away with no force behind it. The man dared to give Izuku a peck on the cheek, a quick peck that turned into many more as Izuku started to laugh and kick. Izuku wiggled in a false attempt at escape, not fighting at all as Flecht peppered kisses on his cheeks and forehead. Chimera quickly woke to the noise, eyes settling in on Izuku. Said Izuku was trying to hold back a laugh as Flecht's fingers began to tease his sensitive sides. Chimera didn't waste a second, quickly lapping a dog-like kiss across Izuku's face. Izuku sputtered at the affection, having to screw his eyes shut so Chimera's drool wouldn't get in them. "Stop!" Izuku squeaked with laughter. The men relented, Chimera looking a little pouty. Izuku rubbed his face clean with his sleeves as he calmed down. Izuku was still grinning like a fool when he was done. "You can't gang up on me like that. I can't deal with you both at the same time." Izuku huffed as he started to crawl out of bed. He squawked as someone tugged one of his legs out from under him. He landed harshly on Chimera's tail, the appendage quickly dragging across the floor to bring him back to cuddle. "Lies?" Flecht teased as he pulled Izuku off the limb. "As if," Chimera belted a laugh. Izuku sighed as Flecht hugged him close. Chimera climbed into place behind Izuku, arms coiling around Izuku. Alright, maybe both wasn't the end of the world. It was more or less official now. Flecht and Chimera had won over Izuku. The pair fight way less now, which Izuku was most happy about. They would still silently vie for Izuku's affections, but it wasn't nearly as hostile as it used to be. Though Izuku had to say, the rivalry was very much one-sided. Flecht was more or less unfazed by the idea of sharing Izuku with Chimera. Chimera, on the other hand, seemed a little more possessive. But Chimera seemed willing to share if that meant he got to be with Izuku. Izuku was doing okay with the development, but he was nervous about one thing. Eraserhead, not just the man's apparent homesickness, but how he would react to the relationship. Izuku hadn't exactly run out of the home announcing the relationship, so the news spread a little slowly. Though, slow wasn't exactly the right word, with so few of them around the news traveled rather fast anyways. Izuku was working on a food shed when it happened. He had been watching his teacher and got to see the exact moment of realization on the man's face. It had been Mummy to say something, a small comment that got Aizawa's gears turning. First was doubt, the hero glaring at Mummy for the idea. Then there was a flash of realization as Kai confirmed the idea in defense of his partner. Next, the teacher stared off into space blankly. Finally, Aizawa groaned and put his head in his hands, and muttered something like, "Yagi is going to kill me." Izuku had expected way more, "Are you stupid?" from the hero. But he wasn't complaining. Even so, he felt a little sorry for his teacher. The man probably felt like he'd failed. But no smecks yet dash under freight face. Izuku started moving the food storage to the new shed with Flecht and Chimera's help. The freshly made structure had many shelves on which to stash the food. The food they did had barely filled the space, leaving Izuku thinking. Perhaps they should make more dried meat. Just in case. "Izuku!" Flecht asked from behind him. Izuku hummed with a nod as he eyed the free space. How would you feel about laying with Chimera and myself? Flecht asked innocently. Laying together? They did that every night. Izuku felt heat shoot into his face. Leave it to Flecht to make a question like that. Izuku could hear Chimera sputter, voice dying in his throat. The poor man pitifully whined to Flecht about that not being the way to ask that question. Izuku sighed as he heard the two men start to bicker about the right and wrong way to ask the question. He pinched at the space between his eyes, fighting a headache as it tried to form. He shut his eyes, considering that he was supposed to say to the Well, Izuku began. The men behind him fell silent, watching him carefully as he turned to face them. I don't do that. Two in one thing, let's get that straight. Izuku tried to not roll his eyes as Chimera turned red, his maw falling open before snapping shut again. Flecht just nodded, as if he was making a business plan. All right, noted. Izuku decided to sit, setting himself on the lip of the food shed's doorway. The two men carefully sat in front of him. Chimera was far more fidgety than Flecht, but he was still listening to what Izuku had to say. Izuku noticed Stain walking by, so he tried to keep his voice low. I don't particularly enjoy dirty talk either. Izuku continued. He tried not to react as Stain stopped walking past, turned in place, then sped walk in the opposite direction. Or hitting or any other sort of violence. Flecht nodded obediently. He looked unfazed by the rules, other than a slight blush on his cheeks. And I hate any bodily waste during that sort of thing too. Izuku gave Chimera a thankful look as the man gagged at the idea. Honestly, Izuku didn't care if other people did it, he just didn't find it appealing. And who was he to decide what happened between consenting adults? Anything else? Flecht hummed up to him. Izuku blew out a breath, thinking. Not off the top of my head. Those are the big things. Flecht gave Izuku a warm smile as if they weren't talking about anything lewd. All right, perhaps I should share my dislikes as well? Izuku hesitated for a moment, not really sure if he was ready for that. But it would be best if they were all on the same page. Okay, go ahead. Izuku had to stop Flecht every few seconds, just asking what certain words or phrases meant. In the end, Izuku was beet red with Chimera, and wondered what kind of life Flecht had lived in the past. No wonder he was so polite and cordial with Izuku. The man must have had a lot of partners in the past. Orgies actually. Flecht admitted. Hummer eyes followed the Greek idea of . Please no more. Chimera whined, clamping his talons over his ears. Well, no wonder why Flecht wasn't bothered by sharing Izuku, he was used to way more partners at once than 3. Izuku lazily stirred the broth before him. The smell of herbs and spices a welcome one. Nobu had really picked up the slack on foraging. The man's animalistic nose rivaled Chimera's. Luckily Nobu did always bring his collection to Izuku for a safety check before doing anything. Izuku broke out of the short thought as Gentle scraped jerky into the pot. The dried meat all but immediately began soaking up the broth. The plan for tonight's dinner was to sop out the meat broth with acorn bread. It was a simple meal idea that had everyone drooling. As Izuku continued to stir, he felt a prickle of danger sense. Not quite an alert, but a warning to pay attention. Izuku followed the sensation to the tree line. Izuku narrowed his gaze at the trees. Stalker is back. He murmured to the group. Instantly they tensed, looking at Izuku with worry. Izuku nodded his head in the direction of the feeling. Of course, they all spared glances in that direction. Anyone who had had their back facing the stalker moved around until that wasn't the case anymore. Is it maybe a hero rescue party? Gentle whispered the idea to Stain. The villain shook his head. If so, why hasn't it met up with Izuku or Eraserhead? All it would have to do is wave them over when we aren't looking. Yet neither Izuku nor Eraser have left the group at all. Mummy agreed. Not to mention Izuku, Kai grumbled next. Izuku turned to the villain, giving him an understanding look. You don't like the feel of it either, do you? Izuku shook his head. Not at all. Fell's hostile. Chimera sat up with a growl in his throat, but Izuku stopped him. No one goes into the woods alone. Izuku turned to his teacher. Aizawa looked at him worried as he continued. Not even us two. Izuku expected some fight, but Eraserhead gave him a nod. Could just as likely be a villain as a hero. Some men soured at the word villain, but didn't voice anything. Good, they were all in agreement then. Who do you think the stalker is? Eyes? It felt closer today. Whatever this stalker was, it was getting closer to camp. The hostile energy it gave off was palatable at this point. Izuku was growing more and more sure that it wasn't a hero coming to their rescue. Izuku considered a horrible idea, that it was all for one. This would be just the sort of game the villain would play. Drive them all mad with paranoia, hoping for them to tear each other's throats out. Izuku wouldn't put it past him to do it, maybe even take sick pleasure from it. But was it? Was it all for one? Surely the villain would be doing a much better job than this. If he actually wanted to drive them mad, he could. So, why was everyone just nervous and scared to be alone? If all for one wanted paranoia, he'd split them up for sure. Yet nothing to separate them had happened. Izuku took his eyes off the forest line for the moment. His gaze returned to the strips of pliable bark in front of him. With much trial and error, he'd managed to figure out a way to make baskets from birch tree bark. He made some small, sackel-sized. Some he made much larger, big enough for a person to ball up in. Of course, the size variety exposed the fact he planned many uses for the items. Some for gathering acorns and other wild plants. Others for Chimera to have an easier time carrying his kills. Mummy came to his side just in time to receive a smaller basket. For the pills I gave Kai, Izuku explained as he passed the man the item. Mummy nodded but didn't leave right away. I think I saw something. Alright, tell me. Izuku said he had encouraged everyone to speak freely about their suspicions of their stalker, to help prevent paranoia. The men would be less likely to sneak off and do crazy if they felt they were being heard. Izuku stopped his work to listen fully to Mummy. I was helping Kai pick mint again, right? Mummy began as he sat close to Izuku's side. Mint, good, what then? Izuku encouraged him further. Mummy glanced to the forest and he began to fumble his hands together. I saw something moving in the tree line. Something big. How big? Izuku asked. Chimera big. I actually thought it was him at first, but Mummy's words failed as he looked at his hands, thinking. It was alone first of all. Age isn't the rules, Izuku confirmed. Right? And Chimera follows your rules like words from God, so it couldn't be him. Mummy said a little too earnestly, making Izuku blush a little. Anything else you noticed about it? Izuku asked further. It was white and had long hair, like super long. Mummy continued. He pulled at his own gray locks as he continued. Like way lighter than mine, almost like snow. Izuku hummed. Mummy continued the demonstration by motioning to his hip area. And it went all the way down here. That's when I realized no way in hell it was anyone from camp. Mummy seemed finished, stopping to stare at Izuku with thinly veiled hope. They all wanted this mystery solved, it was eating at everyone. Thank you, Mummy, that's more than I had, I'll have to think a bit. Izuku smiled, giving the man a light pat on his shoulder. I'll try to think of something by dinner. Mummy looked disappointed, but he accepted Izuku's words nonetheless. He stood and gave Izuku a small bow, taking the new med basket with him. Thank you, Izuku, I hope you can figure it out. With that, Mummy left to rejoin Kai. Tall as Chimera, with flowing white hair that reached their waist. Unfortunately, that did not narrow it down much at all. Plenty of villains alone had white hair. Hair that could have grown uncontrolled without Fleck's help cutting it. By now Izuku was sure someone with short hair upon the wrecking of the ship would have such long locks. Izuku was tempted to say Shigaraki, but he was impulsive. Way too much so to be playing the long game like this. Chronostasis would have surely returned to his boss's side, so he wasn't an option. Izuku could also rule out something as strange as a vision of the fourth user of One for All. Hikage's hair was shoulder length at most. So no weird ghost stuff. At least not from One for All. With dead people inside of his own head, Izuku couldn't exactly rule out a haunting of the island. It used to be inhabited after all, not only that but they have been helping themselves to the olive farm. A disgruntled ghost was something Izuku couldn't rule out. Then maybe it was a hero? Maybe they had gone crazy from isolation, turned hostile by their basic instincts. The idea sounded silly, but Izuku couldn't rule that out either. But a hero that fits that description? Even Izuku, a hero nerd, was pulling blanks. There was of course the option that Mummy hadn't seen right. They might have been standing atop something, making them look taller. Maybe they had some sort of cloth draped over them Mummy mistook for hair. Izuku groaned at the headache forming behind his eyes. This was getting stressful. He needed to get a hold of this soon. He couldn't let it continue like this. He dragged his hands across his face, settling his eyes on the forest line. Izuku could feel the stalker watching him back. He couldn't help but glare, a low growl in his throat. He was getting tired of this. This possible threat was just learning more about him and the group. The more it knew, the more dangerous it could become. New rules. Izuku huffed as everyone gathered for dinner. The men looked at him trusting, with hints of worry. Everyone stays inside unless traveling with 2 other people. Instantly some opened their mouths to fight it. We all agree that there is one stalker, yes? Grumpy but silent agreement rounded the camp. With 3 people in out at once, they too can keep watch as one performs whatever duty they need. And for the next rule, unless it is a needed task, you stay inside one of the 2 buildings. Izuku continued. Izuku, don't you think this is a bit? Flecht started, glancing at the rest of the group. Strict. Izuku sighed. I'm aware it is, but I believe it's trying to learn our habits to be able to take advantage of them, something it can't do if we are inside. He continued on. Which brings me to my next rule, each group must be a mix of different people, to avoid predictability. That's why you said 3 and not 2, for the added variable? Aizawa hummed from his spot. Izuku nodded. Correct. Pairs of people are easier to predict, a trio. Not so much. Finally, Izuku had his last words to say. The rest of today, Flecht, Stain, Nobu, and I will teach everyone how to forage and cook, so that we may be a part of the rotation as well. Some seemed not too eager about that, but they relented as always. Izuku thanked the kami they listened to him so willingly. Izuku was restless, again. He grunted, pushing a cuddly Flecht off. The sleeping man fumbled to the floor, unbothered. Izuku let out a huff but continued his escape. He was free of Flecht, now to escape Chimera. Chimera's talons were held tightly around one of Izuku's arms, his tail laid out like a tripwire. Izuku had to work hard to pry off the man's talons and not wake him. Eventually, Izuku managed to slip out of the tight hold. Increasingly careful, Izuku tiptoed around the shifting tail. In due time, he was free. Izuku let out a sigh, turning to the sleeping pair. Flecht was already sleepily feeling around for Izuku, ending up with Chimera's tail instead. Izuku bit back a chuckle as Chimera's face hardened, a small growl forming as his tail angrily flicked at the tip. All Seep Flecht was getting smacked by the said tail but seemed not to notice. Izuku looked away as he started to stretch. He planted his hands on the floor and leaned his weight back, stretching out his sore back. He only groaned, no satisfying pops tonight. That alone made him frown. The least his sore back could do was be satisfying to crack. After a few more failed tries, Izuku gave up and sat down by the home's door. It was the old home, cleaned to perfection like he'd made everyone promise. Despite the 3 of them resting there, they hadn't done anything yet. Their gooiness, as Stain put it, had annoyed the others. To be fair, it was mostly Flecht that drove Stain mad. Chimera and Izuku were just part of that package. So, to avoid a fight, they took the old home. Izuku thought about something he could do in the meantime. There was nothing. Being locked up was boring, and what tasks he could do indoors he'd finished a long time ago. Izuku took to scratching at some bedding as he sat. What could he do? There had to be something. Well, there was one thing Izuku had in mind. Izuku turned to his 2 companions, considering the idea. The 2 men were fast asleep, completely unaware. Perfect. Chunks of grass launched into the air as Izuku ran across the ground with one for all on. He ran across the ground, scuttering up obstacles and diving under fallen trees. The wind rushing past his skin felt amazing. He had his mouth open like a dog, breathing as he raced across the landscape. The night was dim but not dark, perfect for a run. As he sped into a field, glowing insects shot into the sky by the dozens. Izuku skidded to a stop before eyeing the sight. The insects buzzed wildly but quickly found their place again, calming down instantly. As they landed, their light shut off completely. Again. Izuku's mind pleaded. Izuku shot forward again, running forward on his hands and feet to better stir up the insects. Just as before, they shot into the sky with a flash and loud buzz. Izuku laughed, jumping up in the air to chase the swarm. He could do this for hours. He laughed as he ran around more, chasing more of the insects. Into the night sky. He turned it into a sort of game, trying to see how many he could get to fly at once. He ran and raced about the field, ducking and weaving through the tall grass to stir up the bugs. The sound of something squeaking made Izuku pause his run. After a second, Izuku saw a bat was passed with glowing drool. Izuku laughed and ran after the flying mammal. It eeped and squeaked, swooping after the bugs. Izuku scared up. It wasn't alone either. Izuku would break off to chase another bat, it easily flying ahead of him to catch the bugs running from him. Izuku stared wide-eyed at a bat above him, watching as it got fat with the bugs before it flew away. Izuku slowed his run to a stop, tilting his head as he watched the faint shape of the bat fly off. He could see the other full bats doing the same, all returning somewhere with their full bellies. Maybe a roost? As another chubby bat flew over Izuku with its drooling glow, Izuku followed. He ran with one for all, keeping up with the flying creature. His worn hero gloves beat the ground as he ran on all fours, the fastest way he knew how to run. The bats slowly grew in number over him, their bellies so full that they glowed. Izuku followed from under them, not watching his surroundings as he should. Suddenly they were diving down, and there was nothing under Izuku. Izuku yelled as he fell down, quickly activating float. He covered his face as bats whizzed by his face, zipping past inches from his skin. Some bumped into him with enough force to knock his weightless body further into whatever hole they were entering. Izuku sputtered, spinning around to try and free himself. But all he could see was the dark and the glowing of the bats as their swarm pushed him further down. Then, as suddenly as they pushed him, they weren't touching him anymore. He floated for a moment, balled up completely with Black Whip. Noticing the lack of pushing, he peeked out from the ball. First, Izuku saw the bats roosting on a cave ceiling above him. Then, Izuku looked down. He nearly jumped out of his skin as he met eyes with someone. They didn't blink, and Izuku realized it wasn't a person at all. He uncloaked himself from Black Whip and floated down to the statue. It was worn and missing an arm, but otherwise okay. It even had flecks of paint on it in places. Izuku eyed the statue, catching the notice of a carving on their clothing. It was that owl and 3 words again, like on that coin. Izuku hummed, reaching to brush it off, to make sure he was seeing it right. Only to jump again as it made a harsh clicking sound. The emblem sunk into the statue and began to spin in place as a loud grinding sound filled the space. The bats above awoke with a flutter, diving all around, no doubt disoriented by the sound. Izuku dove between the statue's legs for safety, cocooning himself again with Black Whip. After a long groan, the sound stopped. When Izuku peeked again, he realized he'd accidentally snagged a bat in his quirk. "Sorry," he said as he turned the quirk off. The little bat just peeped as it fluttered back up to roost. Izuku crawled from his safety, looking up at the statue. What was all that about? Izuku floated up to glare at the figure. It scared him half to death. As he glared, he happened to look past the figure. A wall had opened in the cave. It showed a very modern hallway behind it. Izuku landed atop the statue, not really believing what he was seeing. He narrowed his eyes at the hall, taking it in. It looked almost like veins of metal, like what you might see right out of a sci-fi movie. He should get the others. Izuku glanced upward, not seeing the way he came in. The bats had taken him somewhere strange, from a direction he didn't know. He might get lost in the caves on the way back up. He swallowed hard. Izuku returned his eyes to the strange hallway. Maybe he had to go through to find a way out. Izuku floated to the hall, nerves itching at him to run. He got only a few feet into the hall when the door slammed shut behind him. He was in darkness for a second, until a trail of lights appeared in the ceiling. They pulsed in a pattern, almost leading down the hall. Izuku was doomed. He gulped but followed the lights down the hall. He walked and walked and walked some more. His body grew tired from his run and all the walking, so he began to float. He floated and floated and floated even more. The repeating lights started to calm him, almost mesmerizing him. But he followed and followed and followed until he couldn't anymore. His eyes fought him for a while and eventually he lost the fight. His eyes closed and he curled up under the throbbing dim lights. Sleep took him moments after. Izuku woke suddenly. The sound of fighting tore him awake, snapping him into awareness. He was on edge instantly, whipping his head around in search of threats. Only he couldn't see. Izuku shook and grabbed at his face, finding something hard covering his eyes. He felt himself try to scream but something in his mouth held the sound in. Izuku yanked at the offending thing, unable to find an edge to rip at. He resorted to shaking his head around, trying to rip the thing off from the momentum. Abruptly something clamped around his waist, sending him into further panic. He jumped and kicked, almost like a bucking bull. Izuku flailed and twisted as he shook and bucked, trying to get free of the things holding him. Dull yelling sounded in his ears, something sharp digging into his shoulders. Suddenly something had him by the head. He screamed again into the thing holding his face, thrashing as best as he could as he felt it getting tighter and tighter. He let out a wail as something cracked. Daylight flooded his senses. He covered his eyes with a pained sound, arms shaking as he hid from the light. As he cowered, the sound softened, turning into nothing but gentle murmurs. "It's okay, I got you, we got you." That was Fleck's voice. Izuku whined as he turned to the man's voice. The hold around his waist shifted to Izuku's chest. Izuku then realized it was Fleck holding onto him. Izuku sniffled as he peeked from between his fingers at the man. Fleck's face was worried and worn. The blue sheen of his quirk flickered in and out, as it had at the end of their fight. Fleck had gotten hurt, what had? Izuku's mind caught up with him. He turned around, spotting Chimera nursing a sore jaw. The man plucked a broken tooth from his maw, and his dark eyes were droopy. Chunks of something stuck to the man's teeth. Chimera must have bit off whatever had been around Izuku's head. Fleck must have been trying to hold him down so Chimera could. Izuku's eyes burned as he fought a sniffle. He turned back to Fleck as a whine rose to his throat. I know, Fleck hummed as he held Izuku tighter. "You didn't mean to." Izuku was about to hug the man back when a resounding boom filled his senses. Izuku jumped, only Fleck's tight hold keeping him from flying off. Izuku's fingers dug into the man's skin as he whipped his head around to the source. The first thing Izuku was a jet plane zip past. Then, Izuku saw the plume of ash. Sheet. Izuku jumped out of Fleck's arms and launched out Black Whip. Fleck and Chimera gasped as Izuku snagged them with the quirk and bolted. Izuku began to run in the opposite direction to the ash cloud. One or all thumped in his veins as he got his bearings. The moment he did, ran in the direction of home. If the volcano was erupting, the thing they had to worry about most was the gas flow. It could broil them alive and suffocate them. Izuku jerked his head toward the sky as another jet whizzed past the open sky. It looked more like a civilian jet, perhaps it was a plane made to research the volcano? Either way, it clearly had spotted them. It was practically circling above them. Izuku prayed it was calling the local emergencies. They needed off this island yesterday. Izuku broke into the camp to see the group already preparing to escape. They were crowding around, nothing but the clothes on their backs and the dogs. The dash. Yeah, big F-off cloud that's zapping the place, we know. Aizawa interrupted Izuku as he rushed past. Zapping the place? Izuku turned to the cloud as he let go of Fleck and Chimera. The thundering cloud was reaching high into the sky, its black mass broken up by frequent flashes of lightning. The bolts would go from the cloud to the ground, making the spot burst into smoke and ash. That was not a normal volcano. Something to do with the strange tech in the cave? Had Izuku activated something by accident? Either way, they had to get off the island. The cloud was spreading, and so were its bolts. It was reaching further and further with those devastating attacks. He didn't want to know what would happen to them if they got struck. Izuku caught sight of the jet again. This time it was heading in a set direction, looping back and going that way again. Was it trying to point them somewhere? Wait here, Izuku ordered as he leaped into the air. Izuku was gone too fast to hear the objections of the group. He ran across the ground after the jet, noticing it stopped circling. Instead, it raced above him, leading him somewhere. He ran in its shadow for a solid minute, skidding to a stop at a shoreline. Nothing, no, not nothing. Across the water, he could see a ship heading right for the shore. The unmistakable emblem of the Coast Guard was visible even from a great distance. Rescue was on the way, he just needed to get everyone here. Izuku turned right around and began to run back. The jet returned as well, constantly watching from above. Izuku skidded into the camp, kicking up dirt and rubble as he did. As the men began to ask questions, he wordlessly grabbed the closest two men by the collar and whipped right back around, and ran. He ran to the shore, seeing the rescue boat was even closer this time. He set the dizzy men on the rocky shore and turned right around again. Back and forth, again and again, until the last of them were on that rocky shore. Some were vomiting from the speed of the run, struggling to catch up. The mother dog yapped at the distant boat as if begging it to hurry. Her puppies were stashed in pockets across the group. Izuku counted the men and dogs as the boat came closer and closer. Wolfram, Nobu, Stain, Gentle, Kai, Mummy, Flecht, Chimera, and Aizawa. The mother dog, Snowma, aka Ash, and the unnamed puppy. Everyone was here. Izuku looked at the boat. It was closer than before, but still a good distance away. He looked up at the jet, seeing it circling as before. Finally, Izuku turned to face the ash cloud. It was too close, the bolts from its mass hitting too close for comfort. Izuku swallowed hard as a bolt hit the trees, setting them alight. He placed a hand on Kai's back as the man began to cough at the smoke. As he stared, Izuku noticed a shape. He squinted at the ashy cloud, not sure he'd seen right. But no, something was in the cloud. Long white flowing hair and tall and thin. Shigaraki? The eyes staring down at him were pale and purple, not red. This was 9, a 9 intent on killing them. Izuku had thought he died, heard that Shigaraki had killed him for sure. So why was he here? And alive at that? No matter, he was threatening the lives of everyone. Not only the group, but their rescuers. By the time the boat reached the shore, 9 would be there too. Not a single one of them would be safe. Izuku turned to the group, watching as the fire smoke started making more cough and choke. Kai was held by Mummy, the latter trying to protect his companion from the smoke with his quirk. The red bands only did so much, leaving Kai and Mummy both choking on the smoke and ash. Wolfram was standing above Nobu and Stain, Gentle trying to protect the small pile with his own quirk. Gentle was fighting the smoke, but it just curled around the edges of his quirk, finding the cowering men anyways. Flecht was horrible, his damaged quirk unable to protect him. The no doubt new experience of smoke in his eyes and lungs was forcing the man onto his knees. He coughed and gagged as Chimera tried to protect him with the wings on his arms. Chimera noticed him, trying to encourage him closer, only to have to hide his own face as the smoke attacked him. Aizawa had the dogs under him as he crouched close to the ground. Izuku locked eyes with the hero. Instantly the man's eyes flashed his realization. Aizawa shook his head, but Izuku ignored him. Izuku turned back to the approaching fire and smoke, locking onto 9 within the cloud. He crouched low, a growl behind his teeth as he glared at the villain. Izuku swore he saw 9 grin down at him. Izuku's legs snapped straight with the power of One for All, launching him into the air. He flew across the sky, squinting past the smoke in his eyes. The 6th user's quirk flared to life, the mist spewing out from Izuku's skin to push away the choking smoke. Izuku reached out his hands, teeth in a snarl as he hurtled toward his target. He felt weightless as Nana's float activated, only to feel heavy as a rock again as Danger Sense slammed into his body. Black Whip lashed out, coating his skin as a bolt of electricity snapped across his skin. The smell of burning flesh barely crossed Izuku's mind as he surged forward. Izuku was inches from 9 when the man threw open his arms with a smile and a crazy look in his eyes. "Come to join Godhood?" 9 called. Izuku only snarled as his hands found a place around 9's throat. If Shigaraki hadn't finished the job after all, Izuku would. Izuku perked up as he heard a door open. He tried to look at his visitor but was interrupted as Recovery Girl yanked yet another piece of metal from his skin. He hissed through his teeth but didn't glare. This needed to be done, as painful as it was. Izuku rubbed at the sore spot as his visitor rounded the bed to see him. Aizawa, the pro hero, looked him over before saying anything. "You almost killed him," Aizawa all but growled. Izuku avoided the man's gaze. Of course, this was a scolding. "I know." Izuku sighed. He flinched as Recovery Girl pulled out another shard. Aizawa let out another groan as he pulled up a chair. "Do you know how long it took to get the public off your butt? We had to go into deep sheet about the effects of isolation and dash." "I know." Izuku growled out. His teacher's face shifted into a glare. "Midoriya, you may have been in charge on that island, but you aren't here," Aizawa growled right back. Izuku avoided the man's gaze as he continued. "You are my student, not some deity, not some savior. I should have kept you safe." Aizawa's voice softened. The tone shift caught Izuku off guard, making him turn to his teacher. "I'm sorry, Midoriya. I'm sorry you had to protect us." The man fell silent. Izuku blinked at his teacher, watching as the man avoided his gaze. Izuku didn't know what to say to this. Recovery Girl huffed as she yanked another metal shard from his skin. "How about a thank you, young man?" Izuku bowed his head. The dash. Only for Recovery Girl to smack him over the head. "Not you." Izuku touched the spot he'd been hit on, looking at the nurse baffled. The sound of his teacher moving caught his focus again. He turned in time to see his teacher bow where he was standing, bowing his head right to Izuku. "Thank you, Midoriya, for everything you did for us." His teacher said. Izuku couldn't hear any sass or annoyance in his voice as he thanked him. It seemed honest. Izuku turned his head confused. "I was just doing what you taught me?" Aizawa sighed as he stood back up. "Please, last I checked I didn't teach you how to make a group of villains believe you were a living god." Izuku turned red, stammering as Recovery Girl snickered. That was an accident. They did that themselves." "Maybe," Aizawa hummed, a smirk forming on his lips. "But you didn't correct them for a good while." Izuku fought to get his words in a proper sentence. But..." Izuku blinked, shocked as his teacher laughed. An actual out-loud laugh. "God, you need to learn when people are just fing with you." Aizawa laughed for a solid second. It took the man an even longer moment to calm down. Even then he had a grin on his face. "You did okay. Mostly, nearly killing 9 was a bit overboard." Izuku sunk again with a nod. As much as 9 deserved what he did to him, Izuku understood why his teacher was upset. Heroes didn't kill people, and Izuku almost did. What would that say about his teacher? The man apparently teaching him to be a hero? "God kid, it's okay. Nedzu has it covered." Aizawa groaned with annoyance. The man leaned against Izuku's hospital bed as he continued. "So, what is it?" the man asked Recovery Girl. The woman hummed as she set down her tools for the moment. It seemed it was some sort of control device. Apparently, All for One's doctor had been testing on 9. The woman tapped a shard of metal she'd tugged from Izuku's skin. It was meant for 9, but Izuku ended up taking the brunt of it instead. "Is that why he went crazy?" Aizawa narrowed his eyes at the metal. "Wait, I did what?" Izuku sat up in his bed more. Aizawa groaned before sitting fully on Izuku's bedside. "Well, you disappeared, everyone was worried so we started looking for you. Flecked Turn found you first, and you proceeded to beat the living shit out of him." Izuku flinched at the idea, sinking in his seat with worry on his face. "Luckily Overhaul pointed out the thing on your face buzzed before you attacked, so it was realized it was making you attack. That's when Flecked Turn got the bright idea to hold you down as Chimera nodded off." Aizawa continued. "Of course, by the time it started coming off, 9 noticed and decided to try and kill everyone. We had to F off and pray Flecked and Chimera got you loose and..." You should have the rest. Aizawa finished. But why? Izuku asked. Why did that happen at all? Aizawa sighed. Nedzu's theory is that that island was a testing ground for 9 all along. After all, 9 wasn't on the transport ship. Nedzu thinks either 9 or someone above him noticed the prison ship and saw an opportunity to get some lackeys. Not anticipating you to become their caretaker. Nedzu says the plan was probably to rescue the survivors so they were loyal to 9, but you beat them to it. So the storm. The shipwreck. Izuku laid back on his bed. 9 the entire time. Aizawa nodded. Oh God, Izuku said breathlessly. It's still a theory, Aizawa tried. Izuku shook his head. A Nedzu theory, so it's probably right. That's fair. Recovery Girl hummed as she started tugging at more metal in Yuzuku's skin. The woman ignored the glare Aizawa sent her. How are Flecht and Chimera? Izuku turned to his teacher. The man smiled. Well, you'll be happy to hear this. Aizawa set a hand on Izuku's head, giving him a gentle pat. Your little group is being put into a program to rehabilitate villains. Apparently, the fact they followed your guidance so willingly was the last straw Nedzu needed to show the Hero Commission villain rehabilitation was possible and worth the investment. Izuku shot up in his seat, fumbling for the bed edge. Really? But I have to see them dash. Izuku hummed happily as he cuddled up to Flecht's side. The man was currently trying to figure out how to fix a support device. I'll tell you, biomechanics are way easier than this crude practice. Flecht growled as he twisted and turned the item in his hands. Izuku snickered at the man's words. Some stuff is kinda clunky. Flecht huffed as he set down the item. It's so. Yeah, clunky. Izuku nosed into the man's shoulder, not fazed by the harsh glare Flecht was giving the item. He was startled for a moment as the workshop's door slid open. He turned to the guest, jumping up when he spotted familiar ears behind an armful of metal scraps. Izuku floated up and took some of the items from Chimera, giggling as Chimera spooked at the sudden change. God, I thought I dropped something. Izuku giggled at the man's expense, quickly floating over to the scrap heap. Chimera followed right behind him, setting down his armful. This honestly feels more like LBR than rehab. Chimera growled. It's just supposed to keep you busy, to keep you out of trouble. Izuku hummed as he set down what he had carried. You could have signed up for anything dash. Chimera stuck his nose up at the mention of other jobs. As if Mr. Tech Million over there took this, and I'd be damned if he got more time with you here than I'd get working somewhere else. Izuku chuckled at Chimera's pout. Jealous much? Izuku cooed.